lineup of speakers for you today. I will keep my introduction and welcome very short. My name is Sarah McMillan. I'm a professor at Purdue. I work with the Center for the Environment on a lot of these types of issues. I'm also a professor in agricultural and biological engineering. Just a couple housekeeping things. We're going to take questions throughout the event through the Q&A platform in WebEx. So please type your questions in there. We'll kind of pay attention to those and get those updated as we go along. And we'll have a Q&A session at the end. And just so you know, the event is being recorded, so it will be posted on the C4E, the Center for the Environment website, as well as the White River Alliance website, so folks can catch this after the fact if they were unable to join us today. I'm going to turn it over to my co-host, Jill Hoffman from the White River Alliance.
Hi, Sarah. Hi, everybody. Thanks. I'm sorry I can't join you by video here. I'm having some technical difficulties with WebEx, but welcome on behalf of the White River Alliance. Thank you so much for caring about Indiana's wetlands, being willing and interested to learn about the science, as well as being willing and interested to learn about how these things are managed from a regulatory perspective. As you know, last year we faced some challenges with Senate Bill 389. So lots has changed on that front, making it even more important to host these conversations. So we are involved in this partnership because our organization supports science-based research to help us make policy decisions. And we are happy to host as an extension of the Indiana Water Summit. So if you're not familiar with that, we take on a lot of different water topics, everything from ag to industry to droughts and flooding. So anyway, we're happy to host this conversation and give ourselves a chance to take a deeper look into wetlands, more so than we could do at the summit. So keep your eyes peeled for other interesting forums that evolve from our work at the Indiana Water Summit. And Sarah, thank you very much for being here and being our first presenter today. We're really excited to have you both as a host and a presenter. So if you guys don't know, Sarah is an associate professor in agriculture, the agricultural and biological engineering at Purdue. Her research focuses on all kinds of impacts of human and water quality and ecosystem function in both agricultural and urban landscapes. So Sarah's bringing a lot of great expertise to us, and we'll kick off the first part of our forum today. So with that, Sarah, I'm handing back to you, and thanks again for being here.
Thanks so much, Jill. So we're just going to dive right in. And hopefully technology will be our friend today. Okay, great. So I'm just going to start us off with some high-level overview of some cool science that's come out on how we can assess ecosystem function of wetlands in a landscape scale. So thinking about these wetlands not as individual, really awesome places, but also how they might function in aggregate in a small watershed or even a large one. I'm going to share with you some research that has been done by folks who work across this discipline, primarily in the Midwest, but in other places as well. And so let's go ahead and get started. And kind of the take-home message from this few sets of slides that I'm going to share with you today is that these wetlands that we see located often in the upper parts of a watershed, so kind of in the upstream parts where we live and work and play, these upstream areas are particularly sensitive to changes in land use, as we noted by some of the legislation that was happening is really kind of trying to balance those needs of human land use and development with ecological function. And so because of their unique location in the landscape, they're a lot more sensitive to those changes, right? But they also, in their functioning, they have a disproportionately large impact on a variety of downstream uses. So we're going to talk briefly about these from my presentation as well as some others here to kind of get us all on the same page about the importance of wetlands for things like flood storage, water quality, biodiversity hotspots, and climate. So if you look at a map of the agricultural Midwest, so what you're seeing here on the left-hand side of your screen is areas that are in drainage in the Midwestern states. So you see Iowa all the way through Ohio, Wisconsin, and a little bit of Michigan. And on the far on the right, the darker brown colors are those areas that are well drained. And then as you go to the grayer colors, those are areas that are not well drained. And so those places where we have put agricultural drainage. And it's this agricultural these types of soils that are not well drained is where wetlands like this picture up here on the top corner primarily used to sit. But over the past development, over the many couple hundred years or so, we have lost a considerable amount of this wetland dominance in our landscape. In some places, 50 to 90% of it has been due to drainage of these landscapes. And so one of the things to think about as we're trying to balance these needs of agriculture and cities and all the things we do is like, how can we think about these wetlands as unique hotspots that we can protect and maybe even restore in some cases? So to start us off with thinking about wetlands, we wanted one of the simplest ways to think of them as buckets on the landscape or places where we can store floodwaters. And what's I think interesting to note is if you look at this figure, there's a lot of things going on, but you see these different little buckets that are representing wetlands of different types. And how connected they are to the river network is driven by the type of wetland that it is. So sometimes we have these geographically isolated wetlands that are over here on the right hand or left hand side of the figure. And they have these more connected wetlands that might be floodplain or riparian wetlands, and they're much more closely connected to the surface river system. But it's these wetlands that lack this direct surface water connection, that have these longer travel times of water from the wetland to the river. That means that release of that water is much, much slower. And by extent, that means that these wetlands that are geographically isolated further up into the system can be disproportionately important for flood storage because they just create that storage that takes longer to drain out. So those are really important places where we have a lot of flood storage, and these can create really important downstream effects of minimizing flooding in downstream locations. So the water quality aspect is directly related to this connectivity as well. And so I'm going to share a study that was done a couple years ago in a basin in Minnesota. And so while not Indiana, it has a lot of similar characteristics to our landscape. So if you look up here at the picture of the maps on the top, you'll see that this little dark watershed has a lot of agricultural land that's in the dark brown, and similarly what we see over here in Indiana. And then, but what's different is that they had a lot of wetlands in this little watershed, somewhere between 50 to 30% of those wetlands. So basically a natural experiment to study the effectiveness of these wetlands across that gradient. And the take-home message is that as those wetlands increased, there was a measurable data-driven decrease in nitrate concentrations that were leaking out of these watersheds. So what they saw at the river outlet. And in fact, when they looked at this across systems and looked at some comparisons, that these wetlands can remove up to 5 times more nitrogen than simply taking farmland out of production. So incredibly important for water quality. Another thing that they looked at, which I found really fascinating, particularly in the context of what we're dealing with in Indiana and these new wetland regulations as well as around the country, is the importance of ephemeral wetlands. So these wetlands that are connected or have water only part of the year, these seasonal wetlands, as well as seasonal rivers and streams. And so I'm going to tell you walk through a little bit of this, is that we see in the springtime, particularly in the Midwest, we have fertilization happening in our agricultural fields to promote production. We also have the most amount of rainfall oftentimes in this time period. So with high fertilization inputs of nitrogen into our landscape and high flows coming out of our rivers because of increased storm events, we see the largest proportion of nitrogen export during this period, so much so that we can kind of well predict the Gulf of Mexico dead zone just by how much rain we get in the Midwest. It's kind of amazing. So what's kind of cool though is during these high flow periods, that's when these ephemeral wetlands are connected. So there's a lot of water, so that river network kind of expands and connects all those ephemeral wetlands to it. And while that increases transport and reduces the amount of time that water travels, it gets there a little faster, but it makes those wetlands more effective. So now in this top graph, and I know there's a lot of data here, but the cool bit about this is that during these periods of high flow, when we have the most load and the most impact on downstream water quality, is when these wetlands are most effective at improving that water quality. So the wetlands, we see a dramatic decrease in nitrate concentrations as wetland concentrations in the watershed increase during these periods of high flow. Does not happen the same during low flow. So precisely when we need it, these wetlands are doing their job. This is really important as we think about changing climates, because as these wetlands as climate change is projected to increase both the magnitude and frequency of storms, it's really, really important that these wetlands exist and are there for us to improve water quality. So with that, I'm going to end my little introduction, so to speak, to our wetland function story and introduce our next speaker. So I need to do a quick pivot. Sorry. All right. So next up is Tyler Hoskins. You ready, Ty? You want to go ahead and start sharing your screen and I'll introduce you.
Sure.
All right, thanks. So Ty is a postdoc in the lab of Professor Marisol Sepulveda in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources at Purdue. Ty's research focuses on PFAS. So you guys may have heard of this in the news and other places, these per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. Ugh, that's a mouthful, right? And much of the work is focusing on the effects of the biota, so amphibians and other different kinds of organisms that live in these wetlands. And they're working at both constructed and natural wetlands across Indiana. So today he's going to share with us a little bit about the connection between these persistent environmental contaminants and the environmental and ecological health that happens in wetlands. So Ty, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, I can hear you great. Thanks.
Okay, great. So yeah, I'm thrilled to be here talking today. I'm a native-born Hoosier. I grew up playing in Hoosier wetlands, and so studying toxicology for all these years. I'm just thrilled to share with you guys some of what I've learned. So just an overview of what I'm going to talk about. As you all know, Indiana is an agricultural state, so I'm going to talk primarily about agricultural contaminants and how they influence wetland ecosystems and ultimately services to Hoosiers. I'm going to use atrazine as an example for a lot of that. I'm going to talk quite a bit about PFAS, or the mouthful that you mentioned, per and polyfluorinated alkyl substances, and how these pose urgent threats to Hoosier wetlands and residents, but how we need more data in our state to characterize this. And then I'm going to talk a bit about how we rely increasingly on constructed wetlands and ask some questions about what this might mean for human contaminant exposure in our state. So Indiana is an agricultural state where wetland loss has been dramatic. More than 55% of our land covers cropland. It's a very important aspect of our economy. Historically, as you mentioned, Sarah, we've lost a lot of wetlands. So in our state, up to or greater than 85% of historical wetlands have been lost, largely to provide space for row crop agriculture. And so industrial row crop agriculture introduces heavy loads of contaminants to U.S. and Hoosier watersheds. And just to give you an idea of the scale here, based on 2012 estimates from the EPA, an estimated 762 million pounds of active ingredient pesticide were applied in the United States, so huge amounts. In Indiana, this is predominantly on corn and soybeans. And so some of the pesticides or contaminants of interest in our state are herbicides, including atrazine, 2,4-D, and glyphosate, some of the most common ones among others. Insecticides, including chlorpyrifos and tefluthrin. Fungicides, rodenticides are also numerous. They're a bit less ubiquitous, but they can be locally important. And then I'm going to talk a bit about biosludge and land applications. And how anything that humans are being exposed to gets excreted, concentrated at wastewater treatment plants, and spread out on the landscape through this really common agricultural practice. And so, as Sarah was talking about a bit, wetlands can trap contaminants in water through retention times, also in sediments, plants, and animals, because these compounds can bioaccumulate in some case. And so overall, this reduces rates of downstream exposure for humans and wildlife. So this is a really important service these wetlands are providing to us. But also we know that contaminants can affect wetland species and communities, and that can occur via a wide variety of mechanisms. And so atrazine is a particularly well-studied example. Over 59 million pounds are applied annually in the US, and you can see here from a sales map from the Pesticide Synthesis Project, Indiana is a hot spot because it's used primarily with corn. Atrazine is highly mobile in runoff, rainfall, and leaches to groundwater, so it moves around in the environment, including into wetlands. And it's toxic via a variety of mechanisms. So it's shown to be an immunotoxin. It has estrogen-like effects. It's associated with increased prevalence of birth defects in humans. And it's been shown to have transgenerational effects, meaning that grandchildren and even great-grandchildren of organisms that were exposed can suffer carryover effects of past exposures that have actually stopped. And then also we know that atrazine has effects on community composition. And I think a really important point I'd like to make here is I'm using this as an example, but atrazine does not act alone. It's one of many contaminants in the environment. And so organisms and humans are exposed to mixtures, and this occurs across environmental gradients. And so all these things can interact to influence the net effects of pesticides on biota and humans. And sometimes these effects can be synergistic such that the sum is greater than the parts. And that's a major challenge in toxicology. I'm going to skip over now to another class of chemicals called the forever chemicals, or PFAS, and how these present a major challenge. So per and polyfluorinated alkyl substances are a class of greater than 4,000 unregulated chemicals that are characterized by these carbon-fluorine bonds. And because the carbon-fluorine bond is so strong, these things exhibit slow or even no degradation in the environment. So that's why they get the name forever chemicals. They come from a variety of sources. So they're primarily used for their surfactant properties. They come from industry. They're heavily used in firefighting foams on defense sites and airports. And then concerningly, from a human health perspective, they're used in consumer products. So Teflon is a classic example, but also any stain or grease repellent fabrics, Gore-Tex as an example, are likely coated with PFAS to give them that property. And because these things are bioaccumulative and there are so many sources in which humans come in contact, PFAS have been detected in the blood of virtually all Americans. And as a result of that, we're excreting these things into our wastewater systems. And a lot of the PFAS, based on the research that we have available, end up in the sludges at wastewater treatment plants. And so that's going to become important later in my talk. Primarily because these things concentrate those PFAS, which are then often refined and applied to cropland as fertilizer. And so this is a huge data gap. We don't know how this practice influences nearby wetlands. So I wanted to point that out. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on health effects. I once heard a pretty respected researcher say you pick a physiological system and there's probably a study that's shown PFAS effects on that system, but there are many. So I've listed a few here. I'd be happy to answer questions about that later, but it's not going to be the focus here. But unlike atrazine, we have very little public data on PFAS exposures for Hoosiers or in Hoosier wetlands. And so I showed you how ubiquitous the sources are on the last slide. So we might predict exposures, and certainly models of surface water have shown that. You can see Indiana being a hotspot here for PFOS in this study. But there's very little publicly available exposure data for our state. And to that point, I wanted to show you guys this map from the Environmental Working Group, where they're compiling publicly available PFAS data. And so you can see here in Indiana, we have a couple of point sources identified. They're in purple, meaning that they're military sites that have reported on this for 2 of the 4,000 that we know of, right? And then you can see in some of our neighboring states, we've begun to look at industrial and airport sources and to characterize drinking water. But in Indiana, we know zero about PFAS in wetlands. Although I am aware of some IDEM efforts to sample fish for PFAS, which is a great start, and I applaud those efforts. But the point here is there's a strong need for more interest in data in PFAS in our state, and that's a point that I want to hammer home here. So overall, if wetlands are negatively impacted by contaminants like atrazine and PFAS, Hoosiers might suffer the consequences. So if we think about just basic ecology, reduced biodiversity, for example, from contaminant exposures leads to a loss of resilience to current and future environmental change. You can think of biodiversity as an insurance policy with multiple species serving similar roles in ecosystems. And as we lose that functional redundancy, the probability of community collapse increases. And so ultimately what we're worried about here is as these communities become simplified or altered, we lose the ecosystem functions, and contaminants may be playing a role in that. And so for my last point, I want to talk a bit about constructed wetlands. So historically, a lot of our research is focused on remnant natural wetlands on the landscape. And certainly these are important and in need of protection, but the reality is they're being increasingly replaced by constructed wetlands. In a lot of cases, these are ponds. These ponds look structurally different from historical wetlands. So they're typically deeper and steeper, and they have very different biological communities than the ones that they're replacing. But with respect to contaminants, I want to pose the question, does this mean that livestock, crop, and human exposure might be more likely? Because in contrast to these natural wetlands, these ponds are often being constructed with direct consumption of water and resident animals in mind. And so you can think about these things being built through mitigation or for agricultural opportunities like irrigation or watering livestock. And then for recreational opportunities like fishing, I'm showing you some fish pictures of my own down here at the retention pond at the end of my street. But the small constructed wetlands now account for like 20% of surface water in the conterminous United States. So this is a fast growing wetland type. And these, if we think of farm ponds, I told you a little bit about how those are being used. People are directly consuming fish from these habitats, and the same for retention ponds. And so I'm wondering if more direct human use of these more common ponds on the landscape might increase human contaminant exposure. I think that's something we need to think more about. So in conclusion, wetlands regulate effects of contaminants on Hoosiers, and our few remaining natural wetlands can be degraded by the contaminants that they do capture. Over time, we predict that this would lead to loss of diversity, wetland resilience to change, and ultimately reduced function. We know that PFAS are widespread, but public data on prevalence, concentrations, and effects in Indiana are absent or sparse. And so there's a need for increased attention on this issue in our state. And lastly, because these constructed wetlands are increasingly common and directly utilized by Hoosiers, I'm curious to know what people think about how this might increase direct human contaminant exposure through use of the resources therein. And that's sort of a current focus in my lab. So I just wanted to mention that as well. But that's all I have. Thank you for the opportunity, and I'd be happy to answer any questions people have a bit later here.
Thanks so much, Ty. That was really great. To keep us moving along, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker. So Jake, if you would like to start sharing your slides, I'll go ahead and get start that process. Hold on one second. Okay, great. Too many windows open. So next up is Dr. Jake Hoeson. Jake is an assistant professor also in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources here at Purdue. Jake's research focuses on the interaction between microbial communities and water chemistry, particularly on freshwater wetlands. He is a wizard at creating these cool emerging and computing technologies to be able to put sensors out that can collect environmental data at low cost. So if you have any questions about that, certainly not wetlands only that we do these kinds of things in. But today he's going to focus his discussion on the role wetlands play in carbon storage and climate. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jake.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here today. So as Sarah said, I'm going to be talking about carbon and wetlands, and of course, we're concerned about carbon because of the global carbon cycle and changes to it that are leading to increases in greenhouse gases. Chief among them, or at least one of the leaders, as you probably know, is carbon dioxide. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the broader implications, but just keep in mind that when we're talking about CO2, we're thinking about climate change drivers here. So wetlands store a lot of carbon, and that's one of the reasons we're interested in them. More than just stopping floods and processing nutrients, we've talked about that. I think you'll hear more about that today. Wetlands also prevent organic matter, which is, we're talking about here, mostly dead plant material, from turning into carbon dioxide. So wetlands store a lot of carbon, 11.52 petagrams of carbon. That's 11.5 trillion kilograms. And that's just in the lower 48 states alone. And to put that in perspective, about 10 petagrams per year of fossil fuels are burned worldwide every year. So this is a pretty large number. Obviously, this is a permanent storage here, but if you released all that, it would be very similar to if we were just all the burning that we're doing of other carbon. So this is a lot. And then if you're familiar with areas further north, the boreal regions, there's even more storage up there. The interesting thing is that inland, by which I mean non-coastal wetlands, store 10 times more carbon than do coastal wetlands. And it's because, as I'll talk about in a minute, they're depressional bowls and they collect up a lot of that wetland muck that maybe seems a little, icky. But this stuff here, we love to measure it because it's our form of black gold, keeping carbon underground. And so that means that these ecosystems are important buffers against climate change. But one of the tricks here, and one of the reasons why I think that wetland conservation is so controversial in some respects, is because the carbon's hidden underground. So a lot of the benefits, we don't see them. So you can see here on this plot to the right, comparing different kinds of ecosystems. Up at the top here, we have total carbon storage. Above ground is in black, below ground is in gray for a variety of different ecosystems. And of course, we think about tropical forests. They're a very important store of carbon, but we see it all, so it's very visual. And so I think that tracks a lot of attention because we have this beautiful ecosystem, and that's very important to protect. And wetlands have a lot of that too. It's just, as you can see here in this blue shaded box, they're storing, pardon me, just as much carbon, but it's all underground. The other thing that I want to kind of point out as well is that on the bottom portion of this figure, these different habitats, these different environments are broken down by land area. And so wetlands are storing the most or among the most carbon of any of these ecosystems total. But if you look down there at the bottom, they also have the smallest land area. So you're getting the biggest bang for the buck in this case, which is one of the reasons why we think these environments are so important. And so something that's really important to the debate that we're talking about right now is that the protection of wetlands is now frequently being tied to whether or not they have surface water connections to streams and other river networks. Well, the problem is that a lot of wetlands work because they're isolated. And so geographically isolated wetlands are increasingly at risk here in Indiana and across the United States to being removed from protection. But in fact, they need to be isolated in order to function. So first of all, most non-coastal wetlands, so if you're not talking about like tidal and marshes and things like that, most other wetlands are these geographically isolated wetlands. So they have no year-round surface connections to other water bodies. And this isolation is actually essential for the retention of water for long periods, and that is essential for carbon storage. And so we've seen what happens when a wetland is no longer geographically isolated. When it gets attached to a perennial network of streams, that's basically what we did when we ditched all of these wetlands over the last couple hundred years for agriculture. We need more drained soils for agriculture. It's much better than wetlands. And so wetlandscapes across the Midwest and elsewhere have been drained. And so you see an image here of that. So you can see this network of drains, and these dark areas are former wetlands that have been drained. And so these ditches are actually going in there, and they go out and they target these wet areas and they drain them out. Tile drain does similar things. And so the point here is that it's kind of a catch-22. It's very difficult to have an inland wetland that operates the way that it should if it has a perennial connection downstream, because then all of the water is going to get drained. That's what a stream does. It drains water. And so establishing these surface connections to streams also releases carbon that's being stored in these wetlands. So wetlands have attributes that allow them to store carbon, but if you drain them, those attributes go away, and I'm going to talk about those here in a moment. And so that means that removing or blocking surface water connections is the first step of wetland restoration. especially when you're talking about these inland wetlands. And so why is that? Well, the accumulation of slowly moving water is really critical, as I've said, to carbon storage. It allows organic matter, again, this dead plant material, to accumulate. Slowly flowing waters quickly lose oxygen, which prevents carbon from being degraded to CO2. You get a different microbial community. You can see that here in this image from my students in my limnology class. We culture wetland muck to find these unique microbial communities. So you can see here that purple sulfur bacteria that we cultured from here in Indiana. So this unique microbial community is taking advantage of these resources, but they're also helping to preserve this organic matter in this oxygen-free environment. And so this is a little cartoon here that kind of demonstrates, I think, why depressional wetlands are so important. And you may remember this from grade school or from other materials, but it's a very important diagram. So you start here with open water in this depressional water body, and plant material and other things die, and they slowly fill up that water body. But even here in slides 3 and 4, we're still looking at a wetland, and you see all that material that's built up. That's organic matter or muck, or in some cases peat, that is in very high density. And so even after the environment is relatively dry and you can still even walk across it, there's still saturated soils under your feet. You just maybe are in a very mature bog or fen, for example, that are completely inundated with water just below the surface, but maybe pretty dry a lot of the year at the surface. But they're still storing a lot of carbon. So why does this organic matter build up? First of all, it's just that depression, as I mentioned. Also, this shaded, slowly moving water introduces low oxygen content. This slows decomposition, and it makes carbon-rich muck, or as I said, in some places, that's peat. Water becomes dark in color as well. You probably are familiar with the dark tannins that are in wetlands. So I'm mostly keeping the water blue, but I changed it here to this brown color because that's the actual color that we see of a lot of wetland water. And it's important to preserving carbon at the bottom because it's protecting against sunlight. And so as a result, we see that this really does have an impact. This is some research comparing carbon sequestration in riverine wetlands versus these depressional, geographically isolated wetlands. And what you can see is that there's consistently more carbon stored in the soils of these black lines, which are the depressional wetlands, than the gray lines, which are the riverine wetlands. And it's because of that depressional bowl shape. But reconnecting wetlands then to make them part of the perennial network does 3 things. First of all, it speeds up water, and that physically carries carbon downstream. So that's kind of an issue. Second, it decreases water cover, and that increases oxygen levels, and that increases decomposition. And so once that water's gone, because you have this temporary connection now, you're going to start losing that organic matter because there's oxygen, and microbes and other organisms can start breaking it down. So you can see in my cartoon that sequestered carbon, this greenish gray, it's starting to go away. Well, we also have more sunlight now being exposed as well because there's no that dark water covering the land anymore. That actually results in photodegradation. And so sunlight itself is actually blasting down on this material. It's a very dark color, it absorbs a lot of light, and that light actually breaks apart chemical bonds into CO2. So we can see experimental evidence supports this. CO2 release is worst when large amounts of plant material are available and wetland conditions are dry. So you can see that actually when conditions are wet, CO2 emissions either with litter or without litter are less. But as you dry things out, that litter becomes available for use, and the usage rate really goes up substantially. So what happens when we remove these wetlands? We release some of the 11.52 petagrams of carbon that's stored in US wetlands, and we lose an ongoing carbon storage and flood storage source. The restoration is also not as effective at preserving existing wetlands. Even 20 to 30 years after a project is complete, carbon storage functions are not restored. What we're seeing here at the top row is more accretion of sediment in these restored wetlands versus these forested wetlands that were never disturbed. And it's resulting in more carbon accumulation, but there's lower concentration of carbon because this is mostly erosion of sediment from the watershed. And so it's actually a problem because these wetlands are filling in. And so that's what we see here is that even decades after this restoration began, these wetlands still have a long way to go to looking like natural forested wetlands. And these are a wide variety of water bodies. So I just wanted to leave you all with this image to remind you that this isn't just little puddles that we're talking about, but actually pretty substantial water bodies. So with that, I just wanted to thank you all very much for your time and attention. Hope you enjoyed the presentation.
Great. Thanks so much, Jake. That was really wonderful. Lots of good pictures too. Can't hurt. Awesome. Okay. Next up is Amy Romig. Amy, if you'd like to start sharing your screen, it looks like you are way ahead of me. Awesome. Okay, great. So Amy's gonna, first I'll introduce Amy and then we'll kind of talk a little bit about what her focus is. So Amy is a partner at Plews, Shadley, Racher and Braun, LLP, where she focuses on environmental and natural resources counseling. So Amy represents clients that are related to projects like for permitting or enforcement actions, but also complex litigation and other proceedings where they need kind of that administrative and judicial forum together. Amy's gonna help us pivot from this look at the science of wetlands to kind of the history of their protection through this changing regulatory landscape that many of us who spoke from the science side kind of alluded to. So with that, Amy, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for coming today.
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity to talk today. I think my talk isn't nearly as exciting, except for I do think that it helps provide the background for why we're having significant changes in how we develop the policy to deal with wetlands. I want to talk about where do our wetland regulations come from. And while it's dry and it's boring, this is important to understand why necessarily we're not protecting all of the ecological values of wetlands the way a lot of people think we should as we're developing this policy. Our wetland regulations originally come from the Clean Water Act, which was developed in 1972 when we didn't have a lot of the science developed for wetlands. It was specifically developed to deal with a lot of the stories you heard about the burning Cuyahoga and the factories that were discharging into the water. So that's the regulatory framework that was developed that we're now using to try to protect wetlands. It was primarily to protect water quality, to make sure that our waters were fishable and swimmable, and it's primarily implemented through our National Pollutants Discharge Elimination System. These are the water permits that show what we can discharge, when we can discharge, and typically people are thinking about end of the pipe, an actual pipe that goes into a river where you can measure the types of pollutants that are coming from that pipe. So it doesn't necessarily match up one-to-one with the things we would look at when we are necessarily regulating wetlands. The definitions, what triggers needing a permit is a discharge of pollutant. And we're often not necessarily discharging pollutants directly into wetlands, but what triggers it is that a pollutant can be any dredged soil or solid waste. So that the soils, when you're digging up things to drain it, that's what triggered needing to get permit for wetlands. But it's only applicable to navigable waters. Those are the things we're protecting. And as Dr. Hoeson told you before, it's kind of interesting that the less connected the wetlands are to navigable waters, the more valuable they are from a carbon storage perspective. So the way that the clean water is set up to protect our waters isn't necessarily tied to the way we need to protect our wetlands. Unfortunately, we're stuck with the traditional definitions where point source is like a pipe, the end of the pipe. Pollution is what we think of as chemicals, which isn't necessarily one-to-one with wetlands. With respect to, before you can do anything impacts a wetland, you have to get a permit, a 404 permit, and I think you'll hear a little bit more from the Corps of Engineers later about how that works. But this only applies to what we traditionally call jurisdictional wetlands. Those are the wetlands that the Corps of Engineers and the EPA have jurisdiction over under the Clean Water Act. You'll also hear from IDEM about their permitting for isolated wetlands for state wetlands, but those are called 401 water quality permits. Usually you have to have that and work both with the state and Corps to make sure you have the proper permitting. Now, where we're at with respect to wetlands are typically the Clean Water Act. It covers navigable waters. They're waters that have been used for interstate or foreign commerce. We had some old rules that looked at what value do these particular waters or wetlands have. We used to have what we called the Migratory Bird Rule, that birds migrate across the states. There is some commercial value in that. So to the extent that they stopped in wetlands along their way and they needed that habitat, that was one basis for traditional jurisdiction prior to 2001. You also look at the waters, the destruction of which might impact interstate commerce. So Congress has power over interstate commerce. So to the extent waters can be considered to impact interstate commerce, that was another hook that we could sort of tie these wetlands into and justify regulating them. But we've always excluded those ponds, treatment ponds, or lagoons used for other water treatments. Now, in 2001, I told you about the Migratory Bird Act, in which EPA and the Corps of Engineers had said that we have control over, even those isolated wetlands that aren't connected to navigable waters, because it does impact interstate commerce the way that migratory birds. In 2001, the Supreme Court said, no, that's not the purpose of the Clean Water Act. That's not close enough. And to that extent, the federal government lost jurisdiction over those isolated wetlands whose only hook on jurisdiction had to do with the migratory birds. In 2006, an additional appeal came to the Supreme Court saying, well, what can we do to regulate wetlands? How close do you have to be to a navigable water to be considered jurisdictional for federal regulation? And ever helpful, the Supreme Court did not give us an answer. We had a 4-1-4 opinion. Justice Scalia said that the waters should really only include those relatively permanent, standing, or continuously flowing of bodies of water, and 4 of the justices agreed with him. The other 4 justices had a much more liberal construction, with the one in the middle opinion coming from Justice Kennedy, in which he said you have to have a significant nexus to a traditionally navigable water. What does that mean? Well, luckily, I don't always have to decide that, but that's necessarily a case-by-case, fact-sensitive determination. And our EPA and the Corps of Engineers started looking at it. What do you consider a significant nexus? But it's still fact-by-fact determination, and it's still hard for developers or anyone wanting a permit to know, what does that mean? So in 2015, the Obama administration started to do a rulemaking that followed the Kennedy opinion and started really outlining what does it mean to have a significant nexus. It was immediately appealed in several jurisdictions. It was stayed in some places, not stayed in others. There were issues about what does this even mean and where does it apply. When we had the next administration came in, he issued an executive order requiring that the EPA and the Corps of Engineers to review this rule, and came out with another rule in 2018. It became effective in 2020, which is called the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. And that particular rule followed the Scalia opinion, in which the Trump administration said it has to be a navigable water, which automatically excluded streams, ephemeral streams, and the isolated wetlands that we've learned do have significant ecological value. And in that particular rule, it only covered a limited number of water, and it excluded several categories like ephemeral streams. The reason that this is important is because in arid states like Arizona, every stream is ephemeral. And towards that end, all of the wetlands and water features in Arizona were not considered federal jurisdiction. The EPA and the Corps indicated that 333 projects that traditionally had required 404 permitting suddenly no longer required a permitting. And suddenly we lost a significant amount of federal jurisdiction over valuable wetlands with that rule. In fact, it was nicknamed the Dirty Water Rule. Now, when the Biden administration came in, the first day of his administration, Biden listed our water rule as the #1 thing that the EPA needed to review, and in fact started a new rulemaking on June 9th, 2021, in which they were taking public comment and trying to figure out exactly where do we draw the lines and how do we come up with a more definite definition so that everyone can understand what they're supposed to do, and we can have regulatory certainty. And in fact, they did collect comments until September 3rd, 2021. The Biden administration was going to do the rule in two parts. And the first was to go back to the prior significant Nexus test, but to also start a new rulemaking, because this is something that we're still struggling with. And usually it takes about 2 rules to finish rulemaking. So we were going to have the Trump administration rule for about 2 years, until on August 31st, 2021, a district court for the District of Arizona completely vacated the Navigable Waters Protection Act. In that particular case, 6 Native American tribes sued the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers, claiming that the Trump-era rule failed to protect waterways, and the judge agreed. She completely vacated the rule, stating that it was inconsistent with the purposes of the Clean Water Act to protect our water quality and to provide the ecological services that we need to protect for our waters. She ruled that leaving the rule in place while the current administration did its ordinary rulemaking would actually lead to serious environmental harm. So now we're at the place where we've defaulted back to the prior rule, that the pre-2015 rule, and I think you'll hear a little bit about how that works. So ephemeral streams are now back in the federal jurisdiction, at least if you are looking at doing any permitting after this court decision came out. And we're waiting for the new administration to come up and clarify where we go forward. And to that extent, a lot of what we're hearing today are things that we should take into account and the administration should look at when coming up with a new rule. But, however, the issue we're having, and the reason that we've yo-yoed back and forth, well, quite frankly, for as long as we've had the Clean Water Rule, is that the Clean Water Act by itself really isn't designed to protect wetlands. It's designed to protect navigable waters. And so we will constantly have changes with every administration until we come up with a legislative rather than a judicially crafted solution. So that's something that you can always talk to your legislators about, that to the extent we want to protect these ecological services, we need a rule that's designed to protect wetlands, that we're not shoving it into a legal framework that it doesn't quite fit into. From a practical recommendation, while we're working through these things, because we all know how quickly Congress works on very important issues, is that you need to understand that wetlands are not an exact science. Advocates can disagree about what is considered a wetland, what is not considered a wetland with respect to federal and state jurisdiction. Wetlands change with changing climate, weather, and stormwater flow patterns. I have worked at sites where you've changed the stormwater flow pattern and wetlands start developing within a very short amount of time. So to the extent you think you might have wetlands on your property, you need to not presume that old designations are adequate. You need to update your review. Typically, the Corps and IDEM consider a delineation good for 5 years. But honestly, I suggest that people understand their property and look even more frequently. But most important, be proactive in working with agencies prior to development, because permitting is always cheaper than enforcement. And I know this isn't nearly as exciting as a lot of the fun science talks, but you have my contact information and you're welcome to contact me if you have any questions about the legal framework. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. That certainly was not boring. It was very, very informative and really helpful to give us a history lesson on how this all came to pass. And hopefully, and after the break, so what we're going to do now is take a short break. And I see a few emoji clappings. That's fantastic. Thank you, everyone. Just like to say another thank you to all of our speakers, to Tyler, Jake, and Amy for sharing a bit about the science and then giving us a introduction to some of the regulatory things we're going to dig into deeper after our break. So just going to take a few-minute break here. Let's see. I'm trying to look at the agenda. Can somebody help me out? I have too many windows open. There it is. We are running a little, no, we're actually running right on time. Perfect. Unbelievable. So we actually have a 20-minute break from 3:50 to 4:10. So my suggestion is that everybody kind of take a minute to do what you need to do. Come back on. We'll just stay here. We have a few announcements at the start. I know, right? So let's go ahead and do that, and then we'll rejoin in about 20 minutes. So thank you all for your attention so far, and thanks to our great presenters. We'll be back soon. And Robbie, did you want me to put back our screen from before, or did you have something to share?
I think we were going to show that image from Indra to let folks know about that other event. Do you have access to that, Sarah? Or
I do.
I have that. I can put
Robbie,
it up.
you have it? Okay.
Yep.
Perfect. Thank you.
Guys, that was awesome.
Hi, everyone. This is Sarah. We're about 5 more minutes out before we'll get started back from our break. I saw a few chats pop in, folks who were kind of wondering why we were quiet. So sorry about that confusion if there was. We'll be back in about 5 minutes, just giving some time for folks who wanted to see the second half to make sure we don't miss that opportunity for them to join on the scheduled time. So we'll be starting up here in just a few minutes.
Hi, everyone. Jill Hoffman here with the White River Alliance. I'm just warming you back up from our rather long break, but I want to just thank you for your patience. It's quite challenging to put a lot of academic speakers and regulatory speakers into the same agenda. So it's been great. We still have over 150 people on this call. So thank you so much for being interested in our wetlands and sticking around with us. Sarah, it's nice to see your face back. Thanks for being here, and thanks for your presentation to kick us off and remind us how important our wetlands were and are to us. I loved all those science talks. I saw you kind of having some wow moments as well, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed the presentations this morning. It was a perfect, or this morning, goodness gracious, this first half, you know, the morning of this forum. But yeah, I think that the speakers did an excellent job of combining like some really fundamental science with some of the more cutting edge and more recent research that's out there to try to help us think about this at that scale. So I'm really excited for a bit more discussion as we go along, and thanks for a great start. So now we're going to dig into how do we all interpret this and work through the regulatory framework we have, and what does that mean moving forward?
Yeah, it's funny. I was first taken back and excited to hear the conversation about PFAS. We just hosted that forum about that really important topic. And so bringing that connection to our wetlands was great. And of course, climate is always front and center on our minds too. So I just loved that science. And then I was realizing that, man, that was a lot we gave Amy to do a history so quickly like that of something that has, I think she used the phrase ping pong, which is a bit of how this is felt with wetland regulation. So Amy, just wanted to say thanks for kind of walking us through the many versions of the Clean Water Act and its application. And I think pointing out that what we know about wetlands now scientifically isn't what we knew when we used the Clean Water Act to protect them, and that maybe we need to be looking at some other avenues for protection. So that was a really important framing, I think, that you helped give us as we welcome now the next couple of speakers from our regulatory community. And I just want to do some introductions here. First, I'll get us started with our first speaker. And I have had the pleasure of working with Heather Parsons on a number of advisory committees for IDEM. So I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Heather Parsons. She's a special projects coordinator with IDEM's Office of Water Quality. Heather currently serves as the Office of Water Quality Specialist Special Projects Coordinator, which to me sounds like a catch-all, Heather, for other duties as assigned, as we used to say at the state. So we'll see what she can tell us about that. But Heather holds a master's degree in environmental science focused on applied ecology and water resources, and an undergraduate degree in geography with a focus on GIS and environmental science. Heather has been with the Indiana Department of Environmental Management for 10 years, 7 of which she has served as a wetland and senior wetland specialist covering the northeast part of the state. So if you don't know how that works, our wetlands project managers have regions, and I've happened to cross paths with Heather up there in Lake Country a couple times. So now more specifically, Heather is spending her time following federal rule changes and analyzing how they affect different things in state law and regulation. So really lucky to have her with some on-the-ground experience as well as the regulatory perspective from IDEM. And I can imagine, Heather, you've had a challenging year this last year with the SEA 389 changes. So welcome, and I'm looking forward to having you talk to us a little bit about how some of these values translate and how we are now regulating Indiana state wetlands. Are you able to share your screen, Heather, or how are we doing?
Thanks for that great introduction, Jill, but I think Sarah Keller is actually in front of me so that we sorry.
Is that true? All right. Well, we did maneuver those around quite a bit. So, well, then I'm going to just, you'll be ready to go for your session right after Sarah. Okay.
I think that's great.
But she can't hear you very well. So when you get done speaking, I will send her a message in the chat.
You're going to, okay. All right. Well, I apologize for that. We did, as you know, move this agenda around a couple of times so that we could find the right way to lead into all this. So let me do that. So Amy did kick us off with some WOTUS definitions. So let me turn this over then to Sarah Keller, who is a regulatory specialist for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Sarah Keller is a geologist who works as a regulatory specialist for the Corps at the Louisville District. She is responsible for implementing the Section 404 of the Clean Water Act and Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899, including requests from the Department of Army permits, jurisdictional determinations, and other compliance actions. Sarah has worked with the Corps of Engineers Indianapolis Regulatory Office since 2009. Prior to the Corps, Sarah worked for the Indiana Department of Environmental Management as a project manager, implementing Section 401 of the Clean Water Act and the state's isolated wetlands law. Well, Heather, it looks like you have good support in Sarah there, that you guys both can see this from multiple perspectives. Sarah has also worked for the Department of Transportation, doing NEPA documentation and other regulatory permit applications. So that really makes her quite an expert in a lot of fronts. Sarah holds a BS degree in geology from Ball State University in Muncie. So with that, I will welcome this dynamic duo of regulatory ladies here to the front. And Sarah, you're up first. Thanks for being here.
All right, thank you very much, Jill. Can everybody hear me and can you see my screen?
You are
Yeah,
You're
okay.
all set. Go ahead, Sarah. It looks great.
Okay, great, because my connection here is tenuous at best, so I'm not going to share a video of me for fear of it absolutely crashing me into non-existence. So today I'm going to kind of bounce off of what Amy started talking about. She kind of explained how we got to where we are and why we all need to start wearing a 5-point harness when you're involved with the Clean Water Act, because it just keeps changing. So just a brief touch on what Amy said. How did we get here? So we had that wonderful District of Arizona ruling on August 30th that vacated and remanded the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, or what is commonly known as the Trump Rule, simply because that was during his era. Any approved jurisdictional determinations that were completed on or before September 2nd, if it was completed before that time period, it's under the NWPR. If it was not completed at that point or after, we are now going back to the 1986 regulations and the Rapanos and Swank guidance. Anything are approved jurisdictional determinations, which says what is and is not regulated officially. They're valid for a 5-year period, and just because the regulations change, it does not change the effect. Just because we change regulations, we're not going to go back and reopen an approved jurisdictional determination or a permitting action for that reason. So briefly touching on all the regulations that the Corps is responsible for administering and implementing. We've got Section 9 of the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899. Quick fact, that is our nation's oldest environmental law. This is specifically for dikes and dams in navigable waters of the U.S. You're not going to see that very often nowadays. Section 10, a little bit more familiar with that. That's any kind of work under, around, or on top of navigable waters under the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899. A little caution here, because when I say navigable waters, I am not talking about the DNR's list of navigable waters under their state authority. So I just want to point that out, that those are not the same lists. The next one is not really relevant for our region, but Section 103 of the Marine Research and Sanctuaries Protection Act of 1972, transport of dredge material for purposes of ocean disposal. The one that really hits home for us is Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. This is where the Corps authorizes the discharge of dredged or fill material into waters of the U.S. And when I say fill material, it could be anything, absolutely anything other than pollutants. Those are regulated by a different part of the Clean Water Act. So in these are a few examples of fill in a wetland. We've got riprap for shoreline stabilizations. We've got earthen fill within wetlands. There we go. So here's some key changes between those that were briefly familiar with the NWPR under the Trump regulations and the 1986 regulations with the Swank-Rapanos guidance. We now are back to 7 categories of jurisdictional waters. There is a less restrictive concept of tributary. The NWPR was very, 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 very explicit on what was a tributary, and it was pretty black and white. Ephemeral streams are not categorically excluded. This is a huge one. We lost ephemeral streams under the NWPR. They are now back. So we will regulate ephemeral streams under the Clean Water Act now. There's no requirement for a typical year analysis. There are four different criteria now for wetland adjacency. We're under NWPR. Your wetland had to touch a stream. That was the only requirement there in a nutshell. We need a case-specific significant nexus analysis in order to take jurisdiction over certain types of tributaries and adjacent wetlands. And there are 2 types of excluded waters and 5 categories of what we call preamble waters. These are things that we generally do not regulate. So although Amy touched on these, brief reminder, because with 1986 regulations comes Swank and Rapanos guidance. They are all holding hands here. So again, Swank was the case Solid Waste Agency of Northern Cook County versus the United States in 2003. Basically, the take home from this that we got from this, the guidance says We will not take jurisdiction over isolated intrastate non-navigable waters where the sole basis for jurisdiction is Migratory Bird Rule. We're not going to do that anymore. The other one was Rapanos, which is actually two cases, Rapanos and Carabel, but we just for short call it Rapanos. Involved determination of jurisdiction over wetlands adjacent to non-navigable tributaries. Split Supreme Court decision. As a result, we've got a Rapanos guidance, a Rapanos guidebook, and 2 coordination memos that Corps project managers have to use in order to satisfy the split decision in the Supreme Court and make every justice happy, basically. So the 1986 regulations say there's 7 categories of waters of the US and certain categories of excluded or non-jurisdictional waters. So you got traditional navigable waters, your interstate waters, other waters, impoundments, tributaries, the territorial seas, adjacent wetlands, and your excluded waters. And I'll go into more detail in the next slides. The TNWs, or traditional navigable waters, those are your classics. Those are the big ones. You got Lake Michigan, you've got Wabash River, you've got Ohio River. These are used in interstate or foreign commerce and subject to the ebb and flow of the tide, which in our case, Lake Michigan is a tidal water. So these are jurisdictional by rule, automatically jurisdictional. Again, just a reminder, this does not match DNR's list of navigable waters. They're completely different rules. We publish a list on our website in both, there's Louisville District and Detroit District. We've posted lists of these Section 10 or traditional navigable waters on our website. The A2 waters are interstate waters. That's any water that crosses a state boundary. Pretty easy. It doesn't matter whether it's perennial or ephemeral or a wetland. If it straddles a state boundary, it's going to fall into this category. Ooh, my computer went crazy. Okay, there we go. Your A3 waters, just in it. This is what the Migratory Bird Rule and the swank issue was right here. They tried to use that Migratory Bird Rule to claim, quote, other waters that could be used for interstate or foreign recreation or commerce. We have not claimed a single A3 water since swank in 2001. So you're not going to see that category. Impoundments of jurisdictional waters. These could be wetlands, these could be tributaries. Creating an impoundment does not sever jurisdiction downstream or upstream. If somebody dams up a stream or a wetland, that means the impoundment itself is also a water of the US. Tributaries. So tributaries of any waters that I identified in the previous slides. A tributary can be natural, man-altered, or man-made, as long as it carries flow in, directly or indirectly downstream to that navigable water or traditional navigable water. And I want to go back to there. This photo is actually a photo of a county road. The county road is on the left-hand side. There is a perennial stream that has been ditched and relocated along the edge of that road. So in Indiana, everything's a ditch. Some of it's actually a water of the US. Just want to throw that little cautionary tale out there. So under that wonderful Rapanos guidance we got in 2008, I've got a couple of quotes here that give you an idea of what we're looking at. It says the agencies will assert jurisdiction over non-navigable tributaries of traditional navigable waters that are relatively permanent, where the tributaries typically flow year-round or have continuous flow at least seasonally, which means 3 months or more. And also, we will assert jurisdiction over non-navigable, not relatively permanent tributaries and their adjacent wetlands, where such tributaries and wetlands have a significant nexus to a traditional navigable water. So what that means is we're going to take anything that's considered a relatively permanent water or one seasonal relatively permanent water, which, guys, that means an intermittent stream. As long as it flows 3 months of the year, you know, that's something that we're going to regulate. Anything else, like an ephemeral tributary or a non-adjacent wetland, require that significant nexus analysis, which entails a lot more data collection, and I won't go into too much detail on that. So the territorial seas, again, not really relevant to our poor state, but it just talks about territorial seas and a baseline 3 nautical miles out from that baseline. That falls into the A6. Then we're back into that relevancy here. Adjacent wetlands. The term adjacent means bordering, contiguous, or neighboring. They can be separated from other waters of the U.S. by dikes, barriers, natural river burns, beach dunes, levees, all of that. So they to be adjacent, they can be either abutting with a continuous surface connection and have an unbroken surface or shallow subsurface connection, or can be physically separated by jurisdictional waters by those physical barriers, such as berms, dunes, levees. If they're not directly touching that relatively permanent water, means abutting, then we have to do a significant nexus. So here's some examples of adjacent wetlands. These are examples of wetlands that directly touch a relatively permanent water. On the left, it's a skunk cabbage wetland. It literally goes right up to the edge of that stream. On the right, this is a stream that goes into an impoundment, and these wetlands are right there on the edge. The wetlands that are physically separated from jurisdictional waters, on the left, you have a sand dune up in the Lake Michigan area. That sand dune does not sever jurisdiction here. It just makes it an adjacent wetland needing a significant nexus analysis rather than automatically jurisdictional. The one on the right is a river that's flooding. There are wetlands on the right side of the picture that are separated by this river by a man-made levee. Again, doesn't touch it, so it needs a significant nexus analysis. Here's another one. Here is West Central Indiana site. We have a relatively permanent water. It's an actual perennial stream on the left side of the picture. There on the right side of the picture is a wetland, and there is a swale between them. So that's our key here when we're looking at significant nexus analysis here. We're looking at nexus has to be an unbroken surface connection or shallow subsurface, and they're not talking about groundwater ever. In this case, there's a surface swale. It's always there, and it does flow and provide that connection. I was able to do a significant nexus analysis and determine that there is a nexus there, and I did take jurisdiction on all of those. Not the swale. The connection does not need to be jurisdictional itself. So you may have a connection that's there, for example, the swale, that's not jurisdictional, but it acts as that connection. So getting into our excluded waters, there's a big difference between maybe somebody's on the call that has had experience with this kind of permitting before the NWPR. There's a big difference now how we're doing prior converted cropland now compared to what we did before 2020. There was a memo signed by the NRCS, the Corps, and the US EPA in July of last year. We call it our prior converted cropland or AG memo. We are allowed to rely on the NRCS's Food Security Act determination of that prior converted cropland. If we are provided an NRCS certified determination for any plot of land, we are allowed to rely on that to make that determination of prior converted cropland. If it is prior converted, we will not regulate it under the Clean Water Act, regardless of whether it meets all criteria to be a wetland or not. The only exception here is if it's been abandoned. So under our regulations, it's different than the Food Security Act, but under our regulations, abandonment occurs when the prior converted cropland is not used for or in support of agricultural purposes at least once in the immediately preceding 5 years. Ultimately, US EPA has the ultimate authority under the Clean Water Act to determine if something's prior converted or abandoned. Little caveat there. Other features that are excluded are waste treatment systems. Their waste treatment systems are designed to meet requirements of other provisions of the Clean Water Act, such as Section 402, for example. Stormwater detention basins, again, for 402, that may have discharge permits, but not all stormwater basins fall under this. If you have a 402 permit or some other permit under the Clean Water Act, you fall under it. If you do not, it does not qualify, and we'll have to look at it at a case-specific situation. Once, if somebody is provided a permit to construct a waste treatment system in a jurisdictional water, then once it's constructed, it is now excluded from the Clean Water Act, but everything upstream and downstream of it is still going to be regulated. It does not sever anything upstream and downstream. Oh, my goodness. Okay, so these are categories of waters generally not considered jurisdictional. And I have this Federal Register citation up here because these are what we call, quote, preamble waters. In the preamble to the 1986 regulations, there is a discussion buried in there about features that we generally do not regulate. Again, case by case basis, but wanted to put those out there. One of them is non-tidal drainage and irrigation ditches excavated on dry land. There's some obvious things here. It was constructed in dry land and it was not constructed in a water of the US, so we're not going to regulate it. Artificially irrigated areas which would revert to dry land if the irrigation ceased. Artificial lakes or ponds created by excavating or diking dry land to collect and retain water for purposes such as stock watering, irrigation, settling basins. Rice growing, you're not going to see much in Indiana. Still want to throw it out there because that's the language they used. Artificial reflecting or swimming pools or other small ornamental bodies of water constructed in dry land. Again, that's the key here, was not constructed in a jurisdiction of water. So why would we regulate it anyway? It wasn't in a water of the US. And the other one is water-filled depressions created in dry land incidental to construction activity. So basically, we're talking about quarries, sand and gravel quarries. We're talking about all those borrow pits that you see that maybe NDOT created to construct new roads. As long as those borrow pits were constructed in dry land, we're not going to touch them. Unless, and specifically for the gravel operations and sand operations, we have seen old ones that were constructed within a water of the US, like streams flow in and they flow out. Once that operation is abandoned, then we will look at it as is case-specific situation. We have seen many that were abandoned, and again, the stream flowed in and flowed out, and we asserted jurisdiction on it because they were changing the use to some kind of development, and they were going to discharge fill into it. I'm going to briefly talk about that significant nexus determination that all the Corps project managers know and love. Again, this is only needed if you have something that's not relatively permanent water. Mostly we're talking lakes, perennial streams, intermittent streams, and also not wetlands that directly touch those things, those abutting wetlands. But if you have a non-relatively permanent water like an ephemeral stream, you have wetlands adjacent to those ephemeral streams, or you have wetlands that are physically separated from those relatively permanent waters. Those are all cases we have to do the significant nexus evaluation. That means it's not jurisdictional by default. We have to go through and look at a lot of physical, chemical, and biological characteristics, and we have to see if there's more than speculative effect on the integrity of downstream TNW. So, and this is where I'm going to segue into Heather, does the Clean Water Act regulatory roller coaster have any effect on SEA 389? And those of you that, again, were familiar with some of our permitting during the NWPR, statistically, we regulated a lot less under the NWPR than we did under the 86 regulations and Rapano's guidance and SWINC. So statistically, the state gained a lot of isolated waters during the NWPR. And now that our authority has gone back to the 1986 regulation, we are finding ourselves again taking jurisdiction over a lot more of these resources than we did last year. So that could have an effect on SEA 389 simply by the fact that we're taking more jurisdiction on things, which potentially means that the state will be taking less jurisdiction because they will have less isolated wetlands. The Corps first determines if it falls under federal jurisdiction, and then we hand it off to IDEM. If we say it's not federally jurisdiction, that's where IDEM takes it up under their state law. So if we're taking more of those federal waters, then the state will have less to regulate under their SEA 389. So what's next? Because the roller coaster continues. As of right now, and again, Amy touched on this, but we're going to do the same thing that they did for the NWPR. They are moving ahead, regardless of the Arizona Circuit Court ruling that rolled everybody back to 1986. The administration is in headquarters is continuing to work on this, quote, step one rule, which is to codify us actually going to 1986. Right now, we're using 1986 as a result of judicial decision. They're moving ahead, codifying that in the regulations, that we're going to move back to 1986 officially. When that's done, after that will be what they call the Step 2 rule, which will be establishing a durable definition of waters of the U.S. If you want more information on that, I've got the website down here, www.epa.gov/WOTUS. And I'd say just stay tuned. All right, here's my contact information. I encourage everybody to reach out to me directly if you have any questions. I take phone calls and emails all day long, and I'm happy to talk with anybody that has any questions about their property or just curious about our regulations, I guess.
That's great, Sarah. Thank you so much for that. It's I was sitting here thinking to myself, I read your bio. It said you were a geologist by training, and I wondered if you ever thought you'd be both a historian and a lawyer of sorts. Anyway, it is complicated. It is complicated, and I would also like to acknowledge I'm glad we're rolling back to 1986, as I also heard that New Kids on the Block are coming out with a mixtape tour, so you guys are right in line with the 1986 theme. Anyway, with that, I would like to, I thought a beautiful introduction to Heather Parsons from IDEM too early, but I will just remind you, if you jumped in here late, that Heather is a special projects coordinator with the IDEM Office of Water Quality and has many years of experience serving in different roles at IDEM, including a lot of boots on the ground in wetlands. So Heather, I'm going to turn this over to you because you guys have been through quite a bit of rulemaking in response to SEA 389, and then have to now place that in a new framework of 1986 WOTUS rules. So lots going on in your world to sort out, I'm sure. So if you can help us kind of figure out where we are with isolated wetland regulation in the state, I'd really appreciate that, as would the other 150 people on this call. So welcome, Heather. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Jill. Yeah, it's been a ride, that's for sure. Right, let me share my screen. Does that work for you?
Looks good.
All right, so yes, it's been a very wild ride. The idea was that we were going to focus on what's happened in 2021 related to state regulated wetlands. And even though, you know, the Corps is taking more jurisdiction, IDEM still actually does certify those permits. So this is the wetland regulatory framework that IDEM operates under. We regulate those Section 404 permits. We issue certifications verifying that they're not going to violate state water quality standards. And then, of course, we have the state regulated wetland law. It was established in 2005 to fill that gap. I would note that it was a bipartisan ruling to try and protect Indiana's vulnerable resources of wetlands. And then permitting rules were adopted at 327 IEC 17. Up until 2020, nothing was changed within the state regulated wetland law. But in 2020, there were some minor changes to allow for mitigation requirements to be met through the purchase of in lieu fee credits, as opposed to permittee responsible or mitigation banks, which we don't really get into in this, but are a common way of mitigating impacts. And then provided an exemption to some maintenance that are done on regulated drains, provided they meet certain criteria. So there was a lot that changed. In the beginning, the proposal was to completely get rid of the law altogether, but there was a lot of pushback. And after what I believe are a total of 26 proposed amendments, 14 different areas of the law were either amended to make some changes or added. Not going to go through each of those, but the things that were changed. We added and revised some definitions within the law. The definitions of the different wetland classes were refined to try and attempt to add some clarification. The exemptions and the list of exemptions, there were modifications to some of those. So size exemptions were changed, some things were updated, and then there were some new exemptions added into the law. We also added a new general permit for tile maintenance outside of maintenance done by county surveyors. There were some clarifications on ratios in inland fee mitigation, and permit review timeframes were updated. And then the biggest one is the establishment of the Indiana Wetlands Taskforce. So the definitions that were added or revised, like I said, there were changes to the definition of the different wetland classes, class 1, class 2, and class 3. A definition for cropland was needed, and that is in relationship to a new exemption. Ephemeral streams were defined. In lieu fee, a further definition was added to that. Wetland delineation was updated and the term delineated added in terms of definitions. So what that means is during session, there was a lot of push of we need to make sure that we are still protecting the highest class isolated or non-federally jurisdictional wetlands. So class 3 wetlands are thought of as the highest quality wetlands in Indiana. And so what happened is they made sure that it was clear that if it is a rare ecologically important type of wetland, it is protected as a class 3 wetland. If you have an undisturbed or a minimally disturbed wetland that supports more than minimal wildlife, aquatic habitat, or provides more than minimal hydrologic function, it is also considered a class 3. Now, the undisturbed or minimally disturbed goes in conjunction with the support of more than minimal wildlife, aquatic habitat, or hydrologic function. However, if it is a rare ecologically important type of wetland, it is protected as a class 3 wetland despite any disturbance or coverage of invasive species as it was before. So previously there was you had a class 1 wetland or you had a class 3 wetland, and if you didn't meet those things, you were just class 2. And so they tried to add some more specific information to say, okay, class 2 wetland supports modern habitat or hydrologic function. It might be a wetland that's just dominated by native species, but it doesn't provide the habitat for rare, threatened, or endangered species. The one definition that had no changes to it, obviously, was the class 1 wetland definition. Like I said previously, if you were in a class 3 wetland or class 1 wetland, if you didn't meet either of those, then you were just class 2. By adding some details to class 2 definition, that helps hopefully provide a little bit of clarity. So what happens? How does IDEM react? Well, the class definition change was actually considered effective as of January 1st of 2021. So any determination that was made between January 1st and April 29th when the changes became effective, they might need to be reevaluated. I do know that there have been instances where people have requested to have their Waters of the State determination re-reviewed. But hopefully what we have done is strengthened the protection of the highest quality wetlands. We're trying to make sure that, like you can see in some of these photos, the wetlands, the two on the right are still protected, whereas, wetlands that are out that don't provide a lot of function might not be. There were a lot of changes to the exemption section of the rule. So class 1 wetlands no longer require a permit. Previously, a class 1 wetland could get a general permit. With that said, now there aren't individual permits, based on classification. Class 2 wetlands, the exemption used to be smaller, but now it's up to 3/8 acre, and you can get a cumulative exemption of up to 60%. That being said, the wetland itself can't be more than 3/8 acres, And you then take all of those wetlands that are less than 3/8 acres, and you get up to 60% of that. You don't take 60% of this wetland or 60% of that wetland. Under the state law, streams identified as ephemeral are not regulated under the state law. However, now that they are covered under federal jurisdiction, if the Army Corps of Engineers is going to issue a Section 404 permit for impacts to that ephemeral stream, IDEM would need to issue a 401 water quality certification. Wetlands that are delineated at 3/4 acre or less within the boundaries of a municipality. So this is that one of those new exemptions where wetlands that are 3/4 of an acre don't necessarily need to get a permit from IDEM. However, that does not obviate the need to verify any local regulations. If you are in a municipality, this will override that Class 2 3/8 acre exemption. And then construction development within farmed wetlands. And this is where that definition of cropland comes in as an important, because the development has to occur on cropland. That doesn't mean you're out in an agricultural area and you're going to develop. That means the actual land that you are developing on, what used to be called farmed wetlands. Those are the areas that don't need permits. Now, we do have some fact sheets out there or some technical guidance on these things. The agricultural activity must have occurred in the preceding 5 to 10 years. If it's within the last 10 years, you do need an approved jurisdictional determination. We did create a tile maintenance general permit, and this is areas where you might have wetlands that have established themselves over failed drainage tiles. So the big factors here: must be necessary to restore drainage of land adjacent to the wetland and cannot drain the wetland itself, meaning the tile that goes into the wetland will need to be a solid tile. There are specifics. We issued the public notice May 28th, and it became effective July 30th. If you are in a Class 3 wetland, there's a lot more in the review, and we really need to see that there are a lack of reasonable alternatives than going through that Class 3 wetland. In lieu fee mitigation ratios, it was kind of up in the air as to whether you considered those on-site or off-sites, and they now are considered on-site requirements. The permit review timeframes, previously the law said 120 days from the date of a complete application. Now it's 90 days within the date of a complete application. The additional thing that was added was agency review timeframes on 401 certifications. But as many people might know, there is a 401 certification rule, which does require a pre-filing request 30 days prior to filing an application. So that means that 30 days before you submit your application, you must submit this pre-filing request, and that is now also in the state law. And then finally, the establishment of the Wetlands Task Force. It's comprised of 14 members. The members vary between environmental groups, soil and water conservation districts, industries, agencies. And so the idea is that they're supposed to review and study what's going on with wetlands. What should we do? How do we address some of these needs in Indiana? And then make recommendations to the General Assembly in November of 2022. So the considerations: is it a wetland? I think people don't realize, but there is an actual process. Is it a water of the United States? Again, like Sarah said, the Army Corps of Engineers determines that. And what is the class? What constitutes or creates fill? You must, for the determination, it must use the 1987 Wetland Delineation Manual with the Midwest Regional with the regional supplements, and there are 3 within the state of Indiana. However, the Midwest region covers the majority of Indiana. And then, of course, the Army Corps makes the determination. IDEM cannot make those determinations. We might have a very strong indicator in-house in our minds of what it's going to be, but the Army Corps must make that call. And what class is the wetland? So we worked really hard and developed a wetland class determination worksheet. It follows the definitions. We wanted to make sure that we were using the information that was provided. And then not only that, use science that goes into how wetlands function. So it's not just here's this checkbox. It's what functions are those wetlands providing. We have written up guidance to assist in filling out this form. The guidance is on the website. The form is almost final, but there is a draft copy of the form on our website as well. Within that site, within the page, you can find a video where a project manager, Wes Hauser and Brian Wolf, walk through the worksheet. But again, there have been some changes, and some of those changes were actually in response to feedback that we received during and after doing that webinar on the form. And then the one big thing that we try and push a lot now is our Waterways inquiry request. IDEM and DNR work together to come up with a way that the public could submit information and find out, do I need a permit from IDEM? Do I need a permit from DNR? And can I do that and get a response from both agencies? And this is what we came up with. It's at waterways.in.gov. And you can go in, it's a form. There's a map involved, but you don't need any special software. So instructions are included, which I think makes it very user-friendly. And so that's one specific tool. It won't tell you if you need a Corps permit, but your response will include information about the Army Corps of Engineers. So with that.
Thank you, Heather. Actually, we're going to hold questions or encourage you to continue to use the chat. I saw some good questions coming into the chat. We've left a significant amount of time at the end here to field those. So I'll just remind our presenters to kind of peruse the chat so they're ready for that. Heather, I want to thank you for your work on that and for sharing that and kind of taking us back full circle at that last slide with the checklist to think about the functions of our wetlands and how we classify them. If you guys have been around for this ride the last 2 hours here or so, you'll see that we've had a lot of changing regulations, but our researchers at Purdue pointed out the many and diverse and important functions our wetlands play, which may or may not be reflected in the laws that are governing them. So at least having a worksheet to help us understand how function plays into classification is certainly a step forward. So appreciate that, Heather. Thank you. All right, our next and last speaker up is going to help us kind of put some of this in the context of Indiana landscape. And that speaker is Adam Ward. Adam is an associate professor at Indiana University School of Public and Environmental Affairs. I'd like to just give a shout out as a SPIA grad. So all the SPIAs here, SPIA grads might be on this call. Thanks, Adam, for being here. He specializes in quantifying the transport of water, energy, and pollutants through hydrological landscapes and the ecological impacts of these fluxes. Adam's research focuses on hydrologic connections between streams, their landscapes, and their aquifers as a control on biogeochemical processes and ecosystem function, particularly the transport and fate of compounds in the environment. Wow, Adam, that was a lot of science words in one sentence there. I appreciate that throwback to my grad school days, but I really appreciate that you're helping us understand function, in particular, how it relates to moving water and protecting our water. So a few other notes here. Adam's specific interests include the transport of nutrients in agricultural landscapes, the contaminants of emerging concern in streams and wetlands, and the carbon exports from catchments. So this, again, takes us kind of back to the beginning with our other research folks represented here in looking at how the way we're managing our landscapes can create contaminants, creating impacts for our waters and impacts to our climate from carbon, and how important wetlands are in those functions. So Adam's going to share with us a little bit of how this all comes together under this regulatory framework by looking at the impact of WOTUS on wetlands and ephemeral channels in the Wabash Basin specifically. So with that, welcome, Adam. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks a lot, Jill. Yeah, so I'm super excited, everybody, to kind of go, okay, I paid attention for 2 hours. What does this mean for me as a Hoosier? And so we're picking on the Wabash because that covers a majority of our state. And I suppose a couple of disclaimers and notes here. Anything you like, assume that Riley Walsh is responsible. She's a grad student from our program who worked on this, and anything you disagree with or dislike, I'll suffer the slings and arrows. So this is a study we did a few years ago, just trying to say, what does this mean to me when I sit here in Indiana? Because there's a lot of legal terms being thrown around, and there's all these different layers of governance. And a couple of caveats. In contrast to the previous two speakers, I don't have the authority to make any decisions about anything at all. I seemingly, as a professor, have the authority to spout hot air, and sometimes people listen, and often they get rankled or disagree. So these are not actual decisions that I'm presenting. And the goal here was a high-level look at the policy, right? So what might it mean for the state of Indiana and for our wetlands as we take the Clean Water Act and we sort of jerk the wheel left and right from the 1986 version to the Clean Water Rule to the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, and now back again. So that's our goals for today. What the heck does it mean to us in the Wabash? I'll put a link to this in the chat. This is a paper that you can find if you are interested. So I'm starting here in Bloomington, Indiana. That's an aerial photograph of, I'm sitting in that photo, in fact, right now. And so if we all looked at a map like this and asked, well, okay, Clean Water Act is about surface waters. What surface waters are there? We might all pick these ones out. So that's Lake Monroe or Monroe Reservoir, where we get our drinking water here in Bloomington, and some major rivers in the area. And some of you might look at that and say, yeah, okay, I see those, but I see other features on the landscape, right? Like these lines that sort of look lighter in color. I don't think that's enough. And so what you're seeing here is places that drain more than 10,000 hectares. And so probably we would all agree those are rivers. Those belong in the category of navigable waters or their tributaries. What gets fuzzier is if we change our standard to 1,000 hectares of drainage area, that network grows. And as we get more and more generous with what we call a stream, that stream network gets longer and longer, to the point where it's probably absurd to think that we would regulate each of these little yellow lines as a tributary, or even smaller than this. And this is really important in the Wabash Basin, because the amount of streams we have is really variable depending on what you think counts as a stream. So the first image I showed you was at 10,000 there. So if you think a stream has to have 10,000 hectares draining to it, you're thinking about things like the White River and relatively large bodies of water, right? Things that are easily providing interstate commerce. And if you're thinking about things that drain half a hectare of land, you're thinking about things that are almost never flowing, and that you can probably hop across even on their deepest flow day. And so this really matters because where we set the scope for streams is going to start to have consequences for wetlands. So on the left, probably a generous definition with too many things being called streams. On the right, maybe too conservative of a definition where we would want more protection. And I'll argue that sort of the space between about 2 hectares and 100 hectares tends to be the space where people are making these decisions. That's from looking at some permits that have been issued and some past studies in the region. And that's a 10-fold range. So that means anything from 37,000 miles to almost 300,000 miles of streams exist in the Wabash. So that's a lot of uncertainty. Why am I so excited about streams? Because the way we protect wetlands has to do with their relationship to those streams. So you first have to ask, well, what streams are you talking about? Did you mean the streams where there was way too many? Or do you mean streams where there were way too few, or somewhere in the middle? Once you pick what streams you're going to protect or consider jurisdictional, then you have to ask, well, how close is the wetland? Is it immediately adjacent, like it's touching the stream? What about a 100-foot buffer? What about a 500-foot buffer away? How close do those need to be in order to derive protection? And that's what I really want to show you is how changing your definitions of what's a stream and how close do you have to be for protection can make a difference in our landscape. So here's streams at 100 hectares of drainage area. I just picked a portion of the state. And if we pick immediately adjacent wetlands, you see these dark green areas start to show up. If you are willing to accept that a wetland that's less than 100 feet away ought to be protected, you get these bright green dots that start to pop in. And if you extend that out to even 500 feet, there are still additional wetlands. And you can imagine that as that buffer grows, more and more wetlands get protected. And so we didn't just look at this for this one place in Indiana. We actually went ahead and assessed this for the whole basin. And so the idea here is, across the bottom, how many streams do you think there are? The left-hand side being a whole bunch of streams, and the right-hand side being there are very few. Like I only count big rivers. And those different colors are about what's the buffer around it. So if you're really generous in what you call a stream, every wetland becomes adjacent. That's probably more generous than our regulators will ever be. And if you're really stingy about what you call a stream, almost nothing is adjacent and nothing is protected. And so that middle ground is where our regulations exist, right? What's a stream? How close ought we be? These lines are based on the rules that were 1986 to the Clean Water Rule in up through basically 2014, and also what we're enforcing today. The Clean Water Rule, where we had that significant nexus test, it changed the definitions a little bit, which we're showing in that red line, of things that are definitely jurisdictional, so wetlands that we would say are absolutely protected. And there was that significant nexus test, right? And so the gap between that red line and orange line, that's where the significant nexus test lives, right? So that's an area of uncertainty in what we're talking about. Well, and again, I think this range from about 2 to 100 hectares is the range where it really matters. And so the idea here would be, if you are really stingy about what you call a stream, so you want it to be really big, like 100 hectares, and immediately adjacent, so you'd bump up to that dark blue line, you're protecting 400,000 acres of wetlands. If you are really generous at the 2 hectare level, and you want to apply the significant nexus test in the broadest possible conceptualization, you would encompass essentially every wetland in the state, right? And the 2 prior speakers are dealing with what exists in between those extremes, right? Something between, we could be so generous that everything could be covered, and we can only protect about 2/3 of the state, right? And they're the ones who are trying to make those tough decisions and use their on-the-ground investigations to do so. So I want to also talk about uncertainty, because one of the things that is used to justify changing federal regulations is that they provide additional certainty. Right? Every time we have to send someone out to study a wetland, boots on the ground, do a study in the field, that costs a lot of money. It costs money for the state to review it. It costs money for the developer or landowner who's getting their own scientists to the problem. And so reducing uncertainty is a way that we try to make for more efficient regulations. And so the gap between orange and red, that's uncertainty under the under the Clean Water Rule, And between the blue lines is what we have today and what we had before Trump and Obama got involved, or their administrations got involved. And I think that this is a plot of those uncertainties. So how many acres of wetland are we talking about, right? What's that uncertainty gap? And what we found that was really interesting is, if you require streams to be really large to make your decisions, uncertainty might have gone up under the changing regulations. And if you're very generous about what streams are, uncertainty went down under the Clean Water Rule. And so we can't even decide if our new regulation has made things more or less uncertain using this framework. Right? And the Navigable Waters Protection Rule then, so this was the Trump administration EPA, came in, and it put still a third set of lines on the map in some ways. They said, hey, you have to be immediately adjacent, right? So they took that orange and red line and they pulled it down to the dark blue. So everything that used to be protected, right, is everything above the blue line, so to speak, has kind of lost its protection when we switched to the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. I know it's acronym soup here. And the kicker of that in the Wabash Basin, so when we switched to the, when we switched from the Clean Water Rule to the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, is that somewhere between 7% and 40% of wetlands in our state would have lost their federal protection. Now, how many was it exactly? We don't know because we haven't gone and done the boots on the ground study for every wetland in the state, right? So again, the goal here was a high level bounding of what were these changes. As we now roll back to the 1986 version, these losses or these lack of federal protections will actually come back into place. So more wetlands will be protected under the current status, the post-Nevada decision, than were under the Trump EPA rule, which was called the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. Yowza. Okay. So some things I want to give us maybe as high-level takeaways. So we were looking at 3 periods. Pre-Clean Water Rule, which is actually what we're now using again today. Clean Water Rule, which is what was passed under the Obama administration. And the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, which was the Trump administration EPA. So what happened here? What actually changed in terms of wetlands? When we applied the Clean Water Rule, we defined this uncertainty better. So we started to put some better metrics around uncertainty. I think that was important. The Clean Water Rule under the Obama administration, also for the first time, its definitions meant that some wetlands would not have federal protection. Now that's not a lot of them, maybe 5% of those in the state by our analysis, but that was the first time where there were wetlands that were explicitly excluded from federal protection. That doesn't mean they weren't protected. There were state laws in place, but they created this new category of that's not going to need a permit. You can tell because you're more than 4,000 feet away from a stream that we would consider regulatory. So that's really important. Did the Navigable Waters Protection Rule really reduce uncertainty? I think proponents would argue that it did. It took away the whole yellow area. Wetlands were in or out. There was no more significant nexus test. Either you're protected or you're not protected. And you don't have a bunch of scientists running around trying to make those fuzzy decisions. So it did improve regulatory efficiency, but perhaps did so at the expense of actually protecting wetlands. And it also had the consequence of reducing which wetlands would receive federal protection. In other words, the green bars under the Navigable Waters Rule were smaller than the green bars under the prior ones. So we did get more efficient, but we did so at the expense of protections. So what we were trying to do in all of this is say, from the data we have, maps of wetlands, maps of drainage areas, what do we know about wetlands that are protected, may be protected, meaning they would require a significant nexus test, or explicitly not receiving protection under the Federal Clean Water Act. And so this top bar, when we published the paper, was pre-Clean Water Rule. You can also read that now as the current law that we're enforcing. Somewhere between 75 and 99% of wetlands in Indiana were definitely protected, with the remainder requiring decisions. The Clean Water Rule, the Obama administration version, we had a similar amount protected, We narrowed down the range of who needed significant nexus tests or jurisdictional determinations to be made on the ground. And we created a category of things that were not going to be eligible for federal protections. In the rule that was just repealed, we lost protections overall. We eliminated the yellows altogether, and we put a lot of things in the no federal protection category. So what's my takeaway from all of this? What I would want you to take away is that, we're writing regulations with the goal of making this more efficient. Nobody on the call today is trying to write regulations that are harder to enforce or more confusing for developers, for landowners, or for regulatory agencies, right? And so that's an important point. The other thing I would note is that these are not arbitrary decisions. So the language that gets used when these regulations are written is incredibly important, because that means the difference between, protecting or not protecting hundreds of thousands of acres of wetlands within the Wabash Basin. So there are real consequences to what gets federally protected. The final note, and one of our earlier speakers mentioned this as well, until we pass regulations, like an amendment to the Clean Water Act, all of the rulemaking process can be reversed as we change administrations, because these are all executive branch agencies. And so if we would like to see the most reliable regulation, we would want to be asking our representatives and our senators to pass legislation, not leave it to the executive branch where rules can be made and unmade and reinterpreted. Okay, that's what I wanted to share with you all today. Thank you so much. And I think we as a group will now take questions. Yeah, thanks everybody for your time.
That is correct. Thank you so much, Adam. I think you warned us you were about ready to spout hot air is what I wrote down, but I'm not sure that that was what you did. I think that was an interesting way to kind of look at things here. So appreciate that. Just want to remind you guys to please put comments in the chat. Sarah is going to come back in and help moderate this Q&A for us. I just wanted to also make sure I reminded you guys that on the break, we were posting another event to carry on a different element of this conversation on October 20th regarding advocacy. So I'll be putting some information in the chat for you about that, but please fill the chat with your questions. We'll funnel those to our speakers, and we really appreciate your participation in this. I've learned over hosting these, this is where you really learn where the rubber meets the road is when we can Q&A kind of sort it out. So please join us for that. Sarah?
All right. Thank you so much. And great talks in the back half. I'm super optimistic and also a little confused, but that's okay. We're going to unpack all these things and hopefully get there. So we have a suite of questions that folks have been talking about in the chat and in the Q&A, and I don't want to spend a lot of time going over things that folks have already answered, but I do think there are some that would be helpful to kind of come back to. And so, and I think one of them that was recently posted is kind of a nice way to start this off, because basically what we're talking about is this jurisdictional question. And so the most recent question is the one I'm going to start with, actually. And this is for probably our IDEM folks and our Army Corps folks. But for clarity, have IDEM and U.S. Army Corps figured out which waterways have returned to federal jurisdiction? Are they still doing things on a case-by-case basis?
Yeah, so it is still case by case. Just because somebody put something on paper doesn't mean we're going to take their word for it. But generally speaking, under the 1986 regulations, we are going to take perennial, intermittent, and ephemeral streams with the caveat that we have to do that significant nexus determination in order to be able to take jurisdiction over ephemeral streams.
So to follow up on that significant nexus determination, you talked a little bit about, Sarah, this is going to follow up for Sarah, in your presentation about how you would do this if it were surface water connection. So you showed the example in the farmland where there was an existing wetland and then a swale and then another wetland nearby. What is the process for determining nexus between when groundwater is the primary connection, not surface water? And how does that all
We
work?
will not take a connection if it's groundwater. So
Okay,
it
the
has to be a
zero.
defined surface. Yeah, zero, not groundwater at all. We do not regulate groundwater and will not take a connection through groundwater. So it has to be a shallow subsurface. So I'm thinking culvert, drainage tile, something like that, or a surface connection such as a channel, a swale, or something like that. It can't be groundwater and it can't be like diffuse sheet flow. It has to be something defined.
That is interesting. I'm curious if any of our speakers wanted to weigh in on that, because I would argue that some of the things that we've been talking about suggest, and Jake's presentation is what I'm thinking of the most, so not to put you on the spot, but it's precisely these missing surface connections that make these wetlands so highly functioning. So I'm just gonna leave it there and see if you have any comments, Jake, and then go on to the next question.
I think the key here is that, and I believe Amy touched on this a little bit, is that the Clean Water Act is nestled under the Commerce Clause. So we are ultimately making determinations of things that could have a chemical, physical, or biological effect on downstream TNWs, traditional navigable waters. So we have to have that connection in order to take jurisdiction on something. So the science absolutely makes sense. What I saw earlier was amazing presentations. But because our regulations are nestled where they are in the Commerce Clause, it's directly related to those downstream waters. And if we can't prove there's a connection or impact to those downstream waters, we just can't take jurisdiction over it under the Clean Water Act.
And I think that this ties into what Adam said, that this is up to legislators to decide to remove this clarity. Because, for example, we do see evidence that even if there's not a surface water connection, even if there's a groundwater connection and it's fairly deep, we see a significant downstream impact on perennial waterways. And so under some interpretations, that would be protected, but the Clean Water Act isn't really written to think about groundwater. They just weren't, it's a decades old law. And so we're stuck in many cases, and this is what Adam was saying, we keep changing rules because in large part, a lot of the legislation, especially at the federal level, just isn't consistent with how we see the world now. But we're stuck with the law as the law, and so they have to work within that as best they can. So even when we do see that significant connection, the law doesn't necessarily see that eye to eye. And there was a time 5 years ago when the Obama rule was not finalized yet or not released, when different districts, U.S. district courts, would apply different standards, and so. There's really a lot of inconsistency as well, just because everybody sees this law through a different lens.
And I might just also throw in, there was a great report from the EPA in 2015, and I'll post it in the chat, that also was acknowledging the science of how those shallow subsurface connections are really important to the physical, chemical, biological integrity of downstream waters. And my sense is that some of the way buffers are applied, like are you within a floodplain or are you within a few hundred feet of a river, also helps to extend protections where we know that those connections are really important to the health and integrity of our traditional navigable waters, without making every single one a significant nexus test, or like prove to me that that wetland in the floodplain is behaving the way that wetland in the floodplain is behaving. But again, that's intent and conversations with science report writers. That is not the opinion of someone who makes that determination on a day-to-day basis.
So Adam, interestingly, part of our significant nexus determinations now, we can cite scientific literature. And honestly, what people are doing in the scientific community is very helpful. If we have that literature, we can use that, especially local, what people at Purdue and IU and everybody are doing. We can use that to help make those determinations, because part of the significant nexus analysis, even by 1986 standards, is the analysis of similarly situated wetlands with the tributary that you're looking at. So we just come in a kind of a shortfall here, is that maybe we're not privy to the newest, best literature that's out there. If it's not being shared with us, we're kind of limited on how much travel we can do and how much training. So anytime people want to share that kind of stuff with us, we're absolutely going to take all of it and give it a read and see if it applies to any case specific situation.
Great. I'm going to stay on this topic for one more quick question, and then we're going to pivot to the regulatory side. This is still kind of regulatory, but more sciencey, I suppose. For ephemeral streams, is there any consideration of drainage size, or is it specifically just flow duration? And that basically is, the question basically is then, can you do this from a desktop, or do you have to physically go out and do these things on the ground?
From a regulatory standpoint, it could be either or both. So a lot of that came during the NWPR when we categorically excluded ephemeral streams. We found ourselves in the field with nearly every single report that we were given because we needed to document the actual stream morphological features because your ephemeral channels are going to look much different than an intermittent or perennial channel. So we kind of had a little bit of our own kind of data collection, so to speak, to see boots on ground to see if it actually was what we were being told it was. We combined that with a lot of climate analysis, precipitation data, stuff like that. Those are all the same principles we can use now under 1986.
Okay, great. Julie Harold, I'm going to pick up your question. Can these class definitions of the wetlands change over time as the wetland might change and develop? And we talked a little bit about this with changing climates and, landscapes and things like that. So I guess this would probably be for you, Heather.
Yeah, I put in a short little answer. So one of the primary pieces of a class 3 definition is a wetland that's undisturbed or minimally disturbed setting. So if the wetland and nothing changes around it over time and the wetland continues to grow, it's going to develop further functions. It's not just going to be providing flood storage. It's now going to be providing more carbon storage. It's going to be providing more habitat, most likely, because it's going to have more layers. So all of those things go into that. So yes, theoretically speaking, a wetland could change its classification over time. Just as we might look at a wetland mitigation site that we look at to see if it's going to replace those functions that the impacted wetland provides. When it first starts, it's not providing a lot of function, and it takes a long time to develop those functions. So the same thing could apply with a wetland classification in terms of it developing further functions.
And just a quick follow-up, is there a process by which that happens automatically, or is that does that review require some trigger from either a development side or other ways in which that might happen?
So in terms of determining the classification, the waters of the state determinations are similar to jurisdictional determinations in that they're good for a period of 5 years. Just like wetland delineations are good for a period of 5 years, because as we all know, a wetland can grow, it can shrink, it can change in various ways. So they're not static on the ground. And that's why oftentimes we were also asked frequently, well, how many wetlands are in Indiana? Well, we don't know. I mean, and how many wetlands are in Indiana today is totally different than how many wetlands are in Indiana 10 years ago or will be in Indiana 10 years from now. These are things that it's not something that's it's not like a pipe in the ground. It's natural.
Thank you. That's helpful. So there's a series of questions about kind of the ag land determination. So I think the one that's most enjoyable for me to read, I'm going to start with, would anyone comment on the Farm Bureau's campaign, quote, "They're coming for your ditches," against WOTUS, which featured images of tiny air depressions versus the real intent of the Clean Water Act? Toss up whoever wants to answer that.
Well, I think we're talking about what's jurisdictional under federal law. So I'm unfamiliar with that particular campaign. However, everything in Indiana can be called a ditch, just because we have such a history of drainage for agricultural purposes. So I always caution, especially the farming community, just because of the name of what you have out there doesn't mean it's not jurisdictional. Some of them could have been constructed in wetlands. Some of them could have relocated a stream historically, and they've just been constructed in this trapezoidal thing that pushes water off as fast as it can. So it's really case by case. We have to do what I like to call a lot of forensic investigation to find out if it was constructed in dry land or if it was constructed within a potential water of the U.S.
So I might just add to that, you know, you can find examples of people saying every drop of water in my grandmother's bird bath will now be the federal government's jurisdiction, and being really upset about it. And you can also find examples of people saying, I'm so excited, every drop of water in my grandma's bird bath will be protected because I love protection. And to me, both of those extremes are well beyond the intent or the actual language of the law. I think those are the kinds of statements where you take, you know, we take some grain of reality and then we extend it to hyperbole well beyond what would actually happen. And I think there were examples over the last several years of that happening on both sides. Both the I want more regulation because I love wetlands, and the I want less regulation because I fundamentally don't want regulation, or I fundamentally prefer to trade my wetlands for developable acres or whatever. So, you know, my sense would, I'm explicitly not picking on one side or the other because I saw over interpretation like that happen on both sides.
Anyone else want to jump in on this conversation about the ag ditches question? I think there was a couple questions that I can follow up with regarding like this comment that you made, Sarah. These are all for you. I'm so sorry. Apparently lots of questions about how this is done at the federal level now that that's where we're at. So you mentioned something about claiming fallow land and the exemptions on that. So the question is, what prevents someone from claiming fallow land to avoid an abandoned converted ag land determination? So this was asked in the chat and you answered it nicely in the chat, but I thought it was a good comment for discussion because there's also another one about if lands are in things like wildlife enhancement, etc., and then after that contract expires, can be reclaimed for farming activity. So there's a lot of like multiple layers of things happening here, and I'm not sure how you want to unpack that, but I'll just kind of let you take it.
So as far as those conservation lands that people were talking about, that's all Food Security Act stuff. Okay, so we have no connection with that other than we are allowed to use their prior converted cropland determination for the Clean Water Act, but we're not required to. Otherwise, all those protection programs where they're getting subsidies to stay out of wetlands or buffers, that's 100% FSA. That's not us. So regardless of whether they walk away from their 20-year program and say, okay, now we want to put it back into production, it's not going to affect the Clean Water Act status. If they want to go out there and put it back into production, there are exemptions under the Clean Water Act for normal farming practices such as plowing. But if they want to go out and clear, for example, mechanically clear forested wetlands because trees have popped up in those 20 years, they can't do that without the proper permits from the Corps, IDEM, or both in some cases. So it's very careful there that we're not related to that program. So we're going to take it as it is. Whatever's there, we could potentially regulate. For fallow fields, fallowing is a very typical agricultural practice that helps the health of agricultural fields. But in our region, this is personally speaking, I'm going to get suspicious if something's been fallow for over 5 years. Because generally speaking, given the crops that we see in Indiana, if something's fallow that long, the only reason I could think of is for some kind of weather event, catastrophic event, some levee busted, dumped a bunch of sediment on a field, for example. But usually I would say it would be unusual for something to fallow for more than 5 years. And again, that's 100% the Corps and EPA is allowed to make that determination. They can tell us it's fallow, we're going to do our research, and we may disagree with them.
Okay. Jill, do you want to just go ahead and state your question, and then we can jump on in for that. You posted a question in the chat, and I think it's kind of a nice way to wrap this up.
Yeah, well, I was kind of thinking, reflecting on this whole thing, because Sarah and I are both going to be serving on the Indiana Wetlands Task Force that's coming up. So we're going to take that role pretty seriously, and in hosting this, hope to continue to have these kinds of conversations with the full community so we can really understand what kinds of ideas need to be brought forward in that task force. So I just, it seems to me, watching the pendulum swing all over the place, and knowing that federal protections often have to kind of be lowest common denominator because they have to fit all the states. But we have significant and interesting wetlands here in the state, many of which are groundwater fed. So I was curious when I was listening to Adam kind of talk about, if it's distance from a stream or adjacency to a stream, we still have a lot of wetlands that come into play without those kinds of buffer analyses. So asking you guys to think about, if we were to think about how to better protect wetlands and not rely on a Clean Water Act that Amy has told us is, sort of not really meant for the full function of wetlands. That's not what it was designed for. If we were to look at some state changes to protect those functions, what do you guys think that would look like? What are the things we should be considering from the policy or regulatory perspective at the state level if we need to fill the gaps that the federal rules don't offer us?
So, Jill, one of my biggest concerns in clients that I represent is regulatory certainty. And a normal person who's looking at, can I do this with my property? Can I do this with my field? They're not necessarily going to be very sophisticated. A lot of times they will hire people to help them. But one of the biggest issues is they need to have a way to define it and understand what they can do with regulatory certainty. So I think that's where, and that's one of the things that SPIA does a great job. I went to SPIA too, is try to figure out the ways that we interpret policies in ways that people can understand it.
I'm just curious what we should be thinking about in terms of if the federal regulations and that swinging pendulum don't always offer us protections. And we've heard you guys talk about carbon values and pollutant mitigation. What kinds of things might be brought into regulation that would help encompass the full functional value of wetlands and get them protected for those functions? Any ideas about that? Or,
well,
I know that's a hard question.
No, it's a really hard question, and I'll just jump in. It's first, apologies if I'm cutting anyone off, but I think that a big part of it is that we need to do a better job. Part of it is we need to do a better job as scientists of linking ground truth data to things that can be used for decision making. So linking ground truth data to GIS data sets, for example, so that people actually, like as Adam discussed, there's different resolutions of stream maps, and it's very difficult to look at one wetland versus another right now and say, okay, which one's actually going to have the greatest effect. So part of it is, I think, trying to tap into what we do know, what we can measure quickly and efficiently in some emerging metrics. But I think the other part of it is really ground truthing a lot of this stuff, so that we know what we're protecting. As someone mentioned, we don't really have a great inventory. If you go down all the way down to some of the smallest wetlands in particular, which can cumulatively really add up, we don't really have a good idea of how the acreage of those in Indiana or across the US right now.
Yeah, I want to endorse the idea of reducing uncertainty. And so, while my own bias as a wetland hugger is that I'd like that uncertainty to favor more wetlands be protected, I actually think it's really hard for people when these laws keep changing. And so if I own a piece of property, if I invest in it because I think there's a developable parcel on it where I'm going to put my home, or I'm going to put a new grain silo or a new whatever, it's really hard for me when those determinations keep changing. So things that reduce that band of uncertainty, right? Which could be things like saying, hey, one thing I liked in the Clean Water Rule was they said, look, if you're within the 100-year floodplain, consider it regulated, right? That's clear and easy. That's a layer that every consultant in the state can download. It's transparent. It's not an agency determination. Well, it's not a state agency determination. It's produced by a third party from that perspective, right? And that's very black and white to somebody. Do I own a property with a wetland in a 100-year floodplain? We're going to call it protected. Move on, right? And some people may win and some people may lose when you do it, but at least it's clear. And so for me, the more we narrow the scope where people like me have to get involved and people like our scientists on the call have to get involved, I think that's actually better because it says, these are the parcels you can develop. These are the ways you can develop. That's the stuff that's out of bounds. Don't touch it. We're all in agreement. And the more we can narrow in that band where it requires boots on the ground, science in the field kind of studies, that's more efficient for regulators and it's more efficient for landowners. So that would be my call, would be, personally, I want more protections, but from a regulatory standpoint, I just want consistent, easy to interpret and map kinds of protections.
Mm-hmm. I would just second that. And just to kind of wrap this up a little bit, I don't want to cut the conversation too short, but be respectful of time too. I think one of the things that Adam's talk really highlighted was it starts with the stream network, and that some of these ephemeral channels, if we were to just extend the stream network for as into all of these spaces that it could be at its finest resolution, we get a whole lot. And then if we move that window down, so maybe a nice way to kind of marry some of these like lines that are easy to understand is to really get intentional about what that drainage network threshold should be or could be, or something to that effect, so that you could put one piece of the information at least relatively clearly defined, and then we have the buffer beyond that. So it's almost like one of the questions in the chat was about like, is there desktop ways to do this? And Sarah's like, no, basically we go out and check everything. And I'm sure that she's wanting to not have to go out and check everything. But as a wetland scientist and somebody who works on a lot of these functions in these wetlands that are only connected by groundwater, we know that they provide incredible amounts of services. So I think that, these things, if we can figure out ways, I agree with Adam, to make it much more clear and not everybody has to go out and make a wetland determination in a way that's this scientist or that scientist or this regulator or that one. I think that would provide some movement forward. I don't know exactly how to do that, but I think there are ways in which we could think about that. So I'm going to, as my job on this task force, all my wetland scientist friends in the state, you're going to probably continue to hear from me over the next coming weeks and months as we get started and getting your input on how these things should continue. And all kinds of texts popping up in the chat. I can't even read them, but anything that we should share out?
I think there's always going to be good and more discussion there, Sarah, on that issue of uncertainty and how that balances with protection. It's a hard task. I know we're running short on time. I just wanted to make sure that you all saw, I put in the chat another discussion happening on wetland advocacy hosted by the Hoosier Environmental Council and the Indiana Wildlife Federation. So that registration link has been added to the chat for you. Sarah, any last thoughts before we wrap up or make these speakers available for you guys? I'm sure they're all willing to talk with you after this. So we have really just a great group.
Absolutely. And my only thing I would like to just add is we will be posting, we've recorded the conversation. So the webinar vote portion has been recorded and it will get posted to our respective websites so that you all can listen at a later date or share with your friends who are unable to attend. I'm not exactly sure how that translates to the chat, so I will do a little digging and figure that out because there was a lot of great conversation going on in the chat that would be nice to at least point everyone to resources and maybe even some conversations that are happened on that side. Really just want to thank everyone for participating and joining us today. Thank you so much for coming in and sharing your thoughts and questions. I really appreciate all of the awesome speakers. We had a wonderful range of interesting science backed by data, implied on the ground, how do we do this, and then forward thinking stuff. So overall, I'm just really grateful to everybody's participation, and this was a really engaging and enlightening event. So thank you so much to all of our speakers. So another round of applause for all of you. Thank you so very much. And with that, I think I'll close it out. All right, thank you so much. If anyone does want to stay on and hang out with us as speakers, we'll stick around for another 5 or so minutes. But with that, we'll just call it a night. Thank you guys so much. Have a great night.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Jill. You guys are awesome.
I see that we still have 65 people here. They're either slow to drop off or just can't get enough of the wetlands talk.
Yes, exactly. I liked your comment, Adam, because I agree that certainty does not necessarily mean we're trying to be minimal regulation. So I think you're right. It often gets interpreted that way, but that's not necessarily what we mean by that. I don't know if you have any further comments, but.
Yeah, so I was just typing in the chat. Tim had asked, is certainty a euphemism for reducing protections? And so my response, I think, would be that I think that we can find examples, and for me, the Clean Water Rule was one such example where certainty was improved, but total coverage or total protections were minimally changed, both in terms of expansions, which was a fear that some groups had articulated, and in terms of contractions of protections. So that, for me, was an example of the gray area getting smaller. Mm-hmm. And I generally think that's a good idea. Also, if only because the rulemaking process ought to require us to be getting more efficient, so as not to create inefficient regulations that require us to have lots more people involved in making decisions more and more complicated than they need to be.
Now, Adam, you've gone and used the E word, which is bad in government, right? Efficiency. And we're always screaming about making things more efficient, but so much of this is out of our hands. They give us what we're supposed to do and say, go do it.
Well, and of course, I don't know that we touched on it. Maybe Sarah touched on it really early today, but the definition of a wetland itself is something we continue to argue about 50 plus years later. And so when we don't know where they are because we can't always agree on what they are, that makes the regulatory jobs that much harder for Sarah and Heather and the rest of the folks.
And they established the use of the 87 manual and then the appropriate regional supplements to that, and I mean that helped. I mean, it didn't really affect the definition in the regulations, which is extremely, in my opinion, generic. For example, if you're familiar with the delineation process, you have to dig a soil pit and determine whether you have wetland soils using a Munsell soil book. Well, when you get out there and you don't have those hydric soil indicators, what happens? Well, you still might have a hydric soil because of the literal definition in the regulations, even though you don't have those indicators that the manual tells you should expect to see. So things like that, drive people through a loop, and I totally get it. But again, I think that was just their attempt. I know they tried to release a 1989 manual that got rolled back to the 87. So it's their closest attempt to at least identifying these wetlands. Though in reality, I tell people a regulatory wetland, so to speak, doesn't define every wetland in Indiana. Just because you may not have all three criteria, dominance of vegetation, hydric soils, and hydrology. You may still have an actual scientific wetland and not a quote regulatory wetland.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to pop this up, and I don't know if anyone wanted to see this. Someone posted, in light of, and this is kind of back to what Ty was saying about our wetlands are now farm ponds and fringing edges of various kinds of, human created wet spaces, and they're being used for all kinds of things. There's a comment in the chat about climate changing causing more rain in the spring and summer, more dry periods in the summer, drought, draining and drying of these wetlands. I think one thing brings up is how do we think about water management and health, human health management, ecological health management in these contexts. Maybe an opportunity to see wetlands as these, multi-use kinds of things. But I think it's an important part to pay attention to what you might be using as your water source. If you're using it as a multiple use for irrigation, let's say, making sure that it's water that's of sufficient quality to do that is going to be really challenging. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, Ty, or if you wanted to address that, because there's still quite a number of participants still hanging on, which is awesome.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
They're waiting for the good gossip.
Yeah, I mean, as runoff increases, any contaminants that don't want to stick to soil are going to end up in these shallow areas. And so, yeah, they sit there. But I think it's really important to think about what are people using those places for, right? And I guess that was one of the 3 points I was hoping to make is with these constructed wetlands that are increasingly prevalent on the landscape, people are using those directly. People stock fish into these ponds so that they can eat them. I fish the one at the end of my street, the retention pond down here all the time. I've eaten bluegill out of there. So yeah, thinking about the human dimension of what are these being used for is super important from a human exposure perspective. And that's coming from someone with a background more in ecology and effects of contaminants on ecosystems. The human health dimension is certainly something that needs to be thought about more.
And I will say, during 389, a lot of people thought, "Oh, Farm Bureau is against IDEM," but there are a lot of farmers out there that are not that. They are very conservation minded. They understand how those wetlands really help them. They understand soil management, and I think as a regulator, I oftentimes saw the other farmers, and instead I finally got to experience some of the ones that are like, no, we understand the value of these wetlands and we need them here. And so I think it's just getting that information out there more and more and more so that people can really see the value that wetlands provide even in those agricultural settings.
No, that's an excellent point, and I've run into all of those types of attitudes myself. I did a field survey on effects of atrazine on frogs a few years ago across a few Midwestern states, and you would run into a diversity of perspectives, right? You'd have some people turn you away at the door and say, I don't want you in my wetlands. I don't want these to be considered wetlands, and certainly I don't want you quantifying chemicals there. And then you'd have other people that would take you down and show you, look, this is the vegetative buffer that I've put in this drainage, and I know that this is a dike system, and I know that what I put on this field is going in here, and I do eat these fish. And so there's a huge opportunity through outreach, I think, to educate and harness the people that do care, because there are a lot of them out there, I think, that are the appliers of some of these pesticides that I'm talking about.
I think it's interesting from my perspective, we represent a lot of different interests in the Alliance, and I've spent a lot of time in a lot of landscapes. But I think my question, and when I keep hearing you guys talk about this, is like, we're regulating it because it's tied to the Clean Water Act, right? Like that's kind of where it came from. And then when that loosened protection, then the state stepped in and created wetland programs. It just really has me wondering, though. I mean, you guys are all talking about these other processes, whether it's flood storage or fishing and people's recreation or carbon sinks. If we're relying on a regulation based solely on clean water and Nexus with navigable waters and these things, we really aren't, we're only getting protection for these other services as a default instead of as a priority. And so when I start to think about wetland policy, I just keep asking myself, if we continue to govern it under the pretenses of the Clean Water Act solely, are we ever going to get what we need? I don't know that that's the truth, but I mean, it just seems the more and more we find these other functional roles, and that's not the intent of the primary regulatory piece in the background, we've got a problem to solve that's different and just fighting over whose jurisdiction is it.
Yeah, and if you recall, Jill, the Clean Water Act started in 1972 in response to, rivers such as the Cuyahoga River catching on fire because of all the industrial pollution being pumped directly in there because it was the easiest thing for industries to do. We need to get rid of it. Let's put it somewhere. Oh, hey, how about this river that also happens to be our drinking water? Didn't make a lot of sense, but it became a point source pollution issue. And like I said, they tied it under the Commerce Clause. So they were concerned about that pollution affecting commerce and use of the river. And that's why it can be frustrating for those who care about the functions and protections of wetlands because we are truly limited. I mean, those are all very important facts that we use to justify their functions, in the significant nexus evaluation and things like that. But ultimately, I think, environmentalists are going to be very frustrated because it's still not going to be enough. And we understand that, but we are definitely kept under, a leash, so to speak, based on the regulations.
I just add, it's not just environmentalists. I mean, we work with a lot of city and town managers dealing with flooding, and wanting, different recreational opportunities in terms of the water amount management, and so it's not a tree hugger conversation, nor is climate change anymore. So, we're looking at risk and abating risk with regulations that, help protect us at a broader scale. These functions that we keep saying are so important. Just some editorial commentary from a watershed coordinator.
I love it. I think one of the things that keeps coming back to me is, as an Iowan, I'm not a native Indiana Hoosier. That's the right word. Indiana is not a thing. I get that. Sorry.
You're not
I've been here
around
for
here.
almost 7 years and I still say the wrong words. But like in Iowa, my home state, like they're dealing with these same things, but they're even more extreme in some cases because of the fight between water and agriculture and cities and water supply. So I think it's also helpful for us as task force folks to, and you guys all helping figure this all out, is can we learn from other states or make, impacts elsewhere and think about how other people are doing things. And Jill and I have been talking about this a lot, like, what can we learn from what other people are doing? But I think everybody's the same place as us for the most part. A lot of folks are still like reeling or just bouncing around with the federal rules. I don't think there's a great synthesis of what other states are doing, but I mean, maybe that's not true, but that just seems to me to be the case.
And honestly, I hate, this is my personal opinion, depending on the state, whether it's red or blue, is how much protection you're going to get. And the fact that Indiana has an isolated wetland law is very fortunate because right next door in Illinois, they don't have one. So if the Corps does not take jurisdiction on it, it isn't regulated by anybody unless there's a municipality or something that has its own regulations.
Right.
Which that topic did come up. Somebody asked about, if the state doesn't regulate it, then what happens? And I know that during some of our discussions, we had a particular consultant call in from Illinois, and apparently she has to deal with a bunch of different local regulations and none of them are the same. So at least in Indiana, we have like one state one. And I've spoken with people who are like, well, I'm going to go to my local authorities and I'm going to tell them we need our own regulations. And I'm like, well, then here we go. So consultants are going to have this hodgepodge of different things if we can't, if the state law had gone away.
But that's true. And I mean, that's the right of those municipalities when we're dealing with lots of impervious surface in our urban areas and they need to deploy zoning ordinances or other protections to protect floodplains and to start protecting wetlands. I mean, that may be the necessity if the state doesn't start to understand how and if we can protect all the functions, because those functions, particularly flood storage and particularly with the climate change and flood storage piece, the municipalities are going to have to contend with more water. And so, they're going to deploy whatever they have to protect their assets, much like they do with other zoning, building principles or, acceptable uses. I mean, we do that locally all the time. It's not an inappropriate application of that, but it's definitely going to become more prevalent if we can't sort it as a state and start to, value the full set of functions, even if they're not tied to the Clean Water Act.
And just really quickly, somebody posted, doesn't the Association of State Wetland Managers have this state-by-state review? They do it every 10 years. I remembered that myself, but I wasn't sure if that was still happening. The latest was in 2015. So there are reports out there. They're synthesis reports where they try to like take, what's happening, general themes, and then there's some more details provided by each state. So things like, where are their wetland programs, where they're not, things like that. So just in case anybody wasn't aware, the extent of that. Then anything else that anyone wanted to chit chat about? From Gary, all an ag drainage district should be a point source. Iowa is a great example for that. We shall see.
Yeah.
Didn't hold up in the courts, but it's still apparently going, right?
Well, I don't know about you, Sarah, but I'd love to know who the 33 people are that are still in this conversation, because we should all go out for dinner and drinks, because apparently you guys are all nerd out on wetlands as much as we do. Right, Sarah? Could be a new tribe for us right here.
This is our new tribe.
Oh no, I'm looking at the list.
Thank you all for sticking around.
Right.
Hopefully it's not like when I teach my classes and I'm like, all right, we're done, when we're doing the Zoom classes, and like there's 5 or 6 people still on. I'm like, yeah, they've already checked out the long time ago. Their computer just is still on. No, I think folks are still posting stuff. So thank you so much. This is great. Yeah, with that, too bad we can't all go out for drinks since we're all scattered around, but the next water summit, right, Jill?
That's right. And I guess just please stay in touch with us. I'm taking my responsibility on that task force pretty seriously. I want to hear all of the good ideas and all of the frustrations. So we will continue to host these conversations through that process, I hope. And, just really welcome you guys to treat Sarah and I in that role, and all the other task force members with the sincerity of giving us a chance to do better in this state than reactions like we had to do so quickly with 389. I think we can be more thoughtful. So I just would like to kick my door wide open. I'm sure Sarah feels the same way, for input. And I look forward to hosting some more talks with you all and the broader audience as well, as we go through what I think is an overdue and important conversation about wetlands in the state.
I couldn't agree more. And there's a question, is when is your next meeting? We haven't had a first meeting, so I don't know. Stay tuned.
Right.
I think the process, I don't know the process, honestly. It's a little bit smoke and mirrors to me. However, I am, my approach is to be very transparent as much as we can. And so my intent, Robbie, you can help me make this happen, is to use the Center for the Environment as a way to help maintain that transparency, because we can post things as they come up, and if we have certain calls for needing certain things to provide input on, we can certainly do that. So that will be a great way for all of us to stay connected. Jill's got a great resource with the her website, lots of things happening there too. So yeah, definitely plan to do that.
All right. Well, I'm going to call on all you scientists and regulators throughout this process, and appreciate you. I'm going to bug out of here because I have to get to another meeting, actually. So,
oh, goodness. I just get to home.
Okay.
It's 6 o'clock.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks again,
But
everyone.
have a great evening.
Everyone, thank you so much for sticking around, and the conversation was great. So take care, all. Thank you.
Good night.